When Roach came back, she sent him for willow branches from the stream and steeped them into a bitter tea. "What is this brew?" Roach asked. Tasting it and making a face, Aspirin Kevin said, "I hope." Roach gave a cup to the clerk, who was past caring what it tasted like, and it seemed to bring his temp down a little. But Rosamond rose steadily all afternoon, till she was shivering with chills by the time Roach left to say vespers. She was almost too hot to touch. Kevin uncovered her and tried to bathe her arms and legs in cool water to bring the fever down, but Rosamond wrenched angrily away from her. "It is not seemly you should touch me thus, sir," she said through chattering teeth. "Be sure I shall tell my father when he returns." Roach didn't come back. Kevin lit the tallow lamps and tucked the bed coverings around Rosamond, wondering what had become of him. She looked worse in the smoky light, her face wan and pinched. She murmured to herself, repeating Anez's name over and over. And once she asked fretfully, "Where is he? He should have been here ere now. He should have been," Kevin thought. The bell had tolled vespers half an hour ago. Roach is in the kitchen, she told herself, making us soup, or he has gone to tell Eloise how Rosamond is. He isn't ill, but she stood up and climbed on the window seat and looked out into the courtyard. It was getting colder, and the dark sky was overcast. There was no one in the courtyard, no light or sound anywhere. Roach opened the door, and she jumped down smiling. "Where have you been?" "I was," she said, and stopped. Roach was wearing his vestments and carrying the oil and viaticum. "No," she thought, glancing at Rosamond. "No, I have been with Alf the Reeve." He said, "I heard his confession. Thank God it's not Rosamond." She thought and then realized what he was saying. The plague was in the village. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Does he have the plague boils?" "Aye." "How many others are in the household?" "His wife and 2 sons." He said tiredly, "I bade her wear a mask and sent her sons to cut willows." "Good," she said. There was nothing good about it. No, that wasn't true. At least it was bubonic plague and not pneumonic. So there was still a chance the wife and 2 sons wouldn't get it. But how many other people had ALF infected, and who had infected him? ALF would not have had any contact with the clerk. He must have caught it from one of the servants. Are any others ill? Nay, it didn't mean anything. They only sent for Roach when they were very ill. When they were frightened, there might be 3 or 4 other cases already in the village, or a dozen. She sat down on the window seat, trying to think what to do. Nothing, she thought. There's nothing you can do. It swept through village after village, killing whole families, whole towns, 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe. No, Rosamond screamed and struggled to rise. Kevin and Roach both dived for her, but she had already lain back down. They covered her up, and she kicked the bedclothes off again. "I will tell Mother Agnes, you wicked child," she murmured. "Let me out." It grew colder in the night. Roach brought up more coals for the brazier, and Kivrin climbed up in the window again to fasten the waxed linen over the window, but it was still freezing. Kevin and Roach huddled by the brazier in turn, trying to catch a little sleep, and woke shivering like Rosamond. The clerk did not shiver, but he complained of the cold, his words slurred and drunken sounding. His feet and hands were cold and without feeling. "They must have a fire," Roach said. "We must take them down to the hall." "You don't understand," she thought. Their only hope lay in keeping the patients isolated, in not letting the infection spread. But it has already spread, she thought, and wondered if ALF's extremities were growing cold, and what he would do for a fire. She had sat in one of their huts by one of their fires. It would not warm a cat. The cats died, she thought, and looked at Rosamond. The shivering racked her poor body, and she seemed already thinner, more wasted. "The life is going out of them," Roach said. "I know," she said, and began picking up the bedclothes. "Tell Maisry to spread straw on the hall floor." The clerk was able to walk down the steps, Kivrin and Roach both supporting him. but Roach had to carry Rosamond in his arms. Eloise and Maisry were spreading straw on the far side of the hall. Agnes was still asleep, and a mighty knot where she had the night before. Her hands folded stiffly before her face, Roach lay Rosamond down and Eloise began to cover her. "Where's my father?" Rosamond demanded hoarsely. "Why is he not here?" Agnes stirred. She would be awake in a minute. And clambering on Rosamond's pallet, gorging at the clerk. She must find some way to keep Agnes safely away from them. Kevin looked up at the beams, but they were too high, even under the loft, to hang. Curtains from and every available coverlid and fur were already being used. She began turning the benches on their sides and pulling them into a barricade. Roach and Eloise came to help, and they tipped the trestle table over and propped it against the benches. Eloise went back over to Rosamond and sat down beside her. Rosamond was asleep, her face flushed with the reddish light from the fire. "You must wear a mask," Kevin said. Eloise nodded, but she didn't move. She smoothed Rosamond's tumbled hair back from her face. "She was my husband's favorite," she said. Rosamond slept nearly half the morning. Kivrin pulled the Yule log off to the side of the hearth and piled cut logs on the fire. She uncovered the clerk's feet so they could feel the heat. During the Black Death, the Pope's doctor had made him sit in a room between two huge bonfires, and he had not caught the plague. Some historians thought the heat had killed the plague. Bacillus, more likely, his keeping away from his highly contagious flock was what had saved him, but it was worth trying. Anything was worth trying. She thought, watching Rosamond. She piled more wood on. Father Roach went to St. Matthew's. Though it was past mid-morning, the bell woke Agnes up. "Who tumbled the benches down?" she asked, running over to the barricade. "You must not come past this fence," Kevin said, standing well back from it. "You must stay by your grandmother." Agnes clambered onto a bench and peered over the top of the trestle table. "I see Rosamond," she said. "Is she dead?" "She's very ill," Kevin said sternly. "You must not come near us. Go and play with your cart. I would see Rosamond," she said, putting one leg over the table. "No," Kevin shouted. "Go and sit with your grandmother." Agnes looked astonished and then burst into tears. "I would see Rosamond," she wailed. But she went over and sat down sulkily beside Amani. Roach came in. "ALF's elder son is ill," he said. "He has the swellings." There were 2 more cases during the morning and 1 in the afternoon, including the steward's wife. All of them had buboes, or small seed-like growths on the lymph glands. Except the steward's wife. Kevin went with Roach to see her. She was nursing the baby, her thin, sharp face even sharper. She was not coughing or vomiting. And Kevin hoped the buboes had simply not developed yet. "Wear masks," she told the steward. "Give the baby milk from the cow. Keep the children from her," she said. Hopelessly, 6 children into rooms. "Don't let it be pneumonic plague." She prayed, "Don't let them all get it." At least Agnes was safe. She had not come near the barricade. Since Kivrin shouted at her, she had sat for a bit, glaring at Kevin with an expression that was so fierce. It would have been comical under other circumstances. And then gone up to the loft to fetch her cart. She had set a place for it at the high table, and they were having a feast. Rosamond was awake. She asked Kivrin for a drink in a hoarse voice, and as soon as Kivrin had given it to her, she fell quietly asleep. Even the clock dozed, the hum of his breathing less loud, and Kivrin sat down gratefully beside Rosamond. She should go out and help Roach with the steward's children, at least make sure he was wearing his mask and washing his hands, but she felt suddenly too tired to move. "If I could just lie down for a minute," she thought. "I might be able to think of something. I will go see." Blackie, Agnes said. Kevin jerked her head around, startled out of what had almost been sleep. Agnes had put on her red cape and hood and was standing as close to the barricade as she dared. "You vowed you would take me to see my hound's grave." "Hush, you will wake your sister," Kevin said. Agnes started to cry. Not the loud wail she used when she wanted her own way, but quiet sobs. She's reached her limit too. Kevin thought, left alone all day, Rosamond and Roach and I all off limits. Everyone busy and distracted and frightened. Poor thing, you vowed. Agnes said, her lip quivering. I cannot take you to see your puppy now. Kevin said gently, but I will tell you a story. We must be very quiet though. She put her finger to her lips. We must not wake Rosamond or the clerk. Agnes wiped her runny nose with her hand. Will you tell me the story of the maiden in the woods? She said in a stage whisper. Yes, can Cart listen? Yes, Kevin whispered, and Agnes tore across the hall to fetch the little wagon, ran back with it and climbed up on the bench. Ready to mount the barricade, you must sit down on the floor against the table. Kevin said, and I will sit here on the other side. I will not be able to hear you, Agnes said, her face clouding up again. Of course you will if you are very quiet. Agnes got down off the bench and sat down. Scooting into position against the table, she set Cart on the floor beside her. You must be very quiet, she said to it. Kivrin went over and looked quickly at her patients, and then sat down against the table and leaned back. Feeling exhausted all over again. Once in a far land, Agnes prompted. Once in a far land there was a maiden. She lived by a great forest. Her father said go not into the woods, but she was wicked and did not listen. Agnes said she was wicked and did not listen. Kevin said she put on her cloak, her red cloak with a hood. Agnes said, and she went into the wood, even though her father told her not to, even though her father told her not to. I'll be perfectly all right. She had told Mr. Dunworthy, I can take care of myself. She should not have gone into the woods. Should she? Agnes said. She wanted to see what was there. She thought she would go just a little way, Kevin said. She should not have, Agnes said. Passing judgment I would not. The woods are dark. The woods are very dark and full of frightening noises. Wolves, Agnes said, and Kevin could hear her scooting closer to the table, trying to get as close to Kevin as she could. Kevin could imagine her huddled against the wood, her knees up hugging the little wagon. The maiden said to herself, I don't like it here, and she tried to go back, but she could not see the path. It was so dark, and suddenly something jumped out at her. A wolf, Agnes breathed. No, Kevin said. It was a bear. And the bear said, What are you doing in my forest? The maiden was frightened. Agnes said in a small, frightened voice, Yes, ho. Please don't eat me, bear. The maiden said, I am lost and cannot find my way home. Now the bear was a kindly bear, though he looked cruel, and he said, I will help you find your way out of the woods. And the maiden said, How it is so dark. We will ask the owl, the bear said. He can see in the dark. She talked on, making up the tale as she went. Oddly comforted by it, Agnes stopped interrupting. And after a while, Kivrin raised herself up, still talking, and looked over the barricade. Do you know the way out of the wood? The bear asked the crow. Yes, the crow said. Agnes was asleep against the table. The cape spilled out around her, and the cart hugged to her chest. She should be covered up, but Kivrin didn't dare. All the bedclothes were full of plague germs. She looked over at Lady Amani praying in the corner, her face to the wall. Lady Armani, she called softly. But the old lady gave no sign. She had heard. Kevin put more wood on the fire and sat back down against the table, leaning her head back. I know the way out of the woods. The crow said, I will show you, Kevin said softly. But he flew away over the treetops so fast they could not follow. She must have slept, because the fire was down when she opened her eyes, and her neck hurt. Rosamond and Agnes still slept, but the clerk was awake. He called to Kevin, his words unrecognizable. The white fur covered his whole tongue, and his breath was so foul. Kevin had to turn her head away to take a breath. His bubo had begun to drain again, a thick dark liquid that smelled like rotting meat. Kivrin put a new bandage on, clenching her teeth to keep from gagging. and carried the old one to the far corner of the hall, and then went out and washed her hands at the well, pouring the icy water from the bucket over one hand, and then the other taking in gulps of the cold air. Roach came into the courtyard, Ulrich Hall's son, he said, walking with her into the house, and one of the steward's sons, the eldest Walthoff. He stumbled into the bench nearest the door. "You're exhausted," Kevin said. "You should lie down and rest." On the other side of the hall, Amani stood up, getting awkwardly to her feet, as though her legs had fallen asleep, and started across the hall toward them. "I cannot stay. I came to fetch a knife to cut willows," Roach said. But he sat down by the fire and stared blankly into it. "Rest a minute at least," Kevin said. "I will fetch you some ale." She pushed the bench to the side and started out. "You have brought this sickness, Lady Armani," said. Kevin turned. The old lady was standing in the middle of the hall, glaring at Roach. She held her book to her chest with both hands. Her reliquary dangled from them. "It is your sins have brought the sickness here." She turned to Kevin. He said, "The litany for Martin Mass on St. Eusebius Day. His alb is dirty." She sounded as she had when she was complaining to Saberlot's sister, and her hands fumbled with the reliquary, counting off his sins on the links of the chain. He put the candles out by pinching them, and broke the wicks. Kivrin watched her, thinking she's trying to justify her own guilt. She wrote the bishop asking for a new chaplain. She told him where they were. She can't bear the knowledge that she helped bring the plague here, Kivrin thought, but she couldn't summon up any pity. "You have no right to blame Roach." She thought he has done everything he can, and you've knelt in a corner and prayed. God has not sent this plague as a punishment. She told Amani coldly, "It's a disease." He forgot the Confessio Ordio. Amani said, but she hobbled back to her corner and lowered herself to her knees. He put the altar candles on the rude screen. Kevin went over to Roach. "No one is to blame," she said. He was staring into the fire. "If God does punish us," he said, "it must be for some terrible sin." "No sin," she said. "It is not a punishment." Dominus, the clerk, cried. Trying to sit up, he coughed again, a racking, terrible cough that sounded like it would tear his chest apart, though nothing came up. The sound woke Rosamond, and she began to whimper. And if it isn't a punishment, Kevin thought it certainly looks like one. Rosamond's sleep had not helped her at all. Her temp was back up again, and her eyes had begun to look sunken. She jerked as if flogged at the slightest movement. "It's killing her," Kevin thought. "I have to do something." When Roach came in again, she went up to the bower and brought down Amaryllis's casket of medicines. Amaryllis watched, her lips moving soundlessly, but when Kivrin sat it in front of her and asked her what was in the linen bags, she put her folded hands up to her face and closed her eyes. Kevin recognized some of them. Dr. Ahrens had made her study medicinal herbs, and she recognized comfrey and lungwort and the crushed leaves of tansy. There was a little pouch of powdered mercury sulfide, which no one in their right mind would give anyone, and a packet of foxglove, which was almost as bad. She boiled water and poured in every herb she recognized, and steeped it. The fragrance was wonderful, like a breath of summer, and it tasted no worse than the willow bark tea, but it didn't help either. By nightfall, the clerk was coughing continuously, and red blotches had begun to appear on Rosamond's stomach and arms. Her bubo was the size of an egg and as hard. When Kevin touched it, she screamed with pain. During the Black Death, the doctors had put poultices on the buboes, or lanced them. They had also bled people and dosed them with arsenic. She thought, though, the clerk had seemed better after his buboes broke, and he was still alive, but lancing it might spread the infection or worse, take it into the bloodstream. She heated water and wet rags to lay on the bubo, but even though the water was lukewarm, Rosamond screamed at the first touch. Kevin had to go back to cold water, which did no good. None of it's doing any good. She thought, holding the wet, cold cloth against Rosamond's armpit. None of it. I must find the drop, she thought. But the woods stretched on for miles, with hundreds of oak trees. Dozens of clearings, she would never find it. And she couldn't leave Rosamond. Perhaps Garwin would turn back. They had closed the gates of some cities. Perhaps he would not be able to get in, or perhaps he would talk to people. On the road and realize Lord Guion must be dead. Come back, she wailed him. Hurry, come back. Kevin went through a miner's bag again. Tasting the contents of the pouches, the yellow powder was sulfur. Doctors had used that during epidemics too, burning it to fumigate the air. And she remembered learning in history of meds that sulfur killed certain bacteria. Though whether that was only in the sulfur compounds, she couldn't remember. It was safer than cutting the bugle open though. She sprinkled a little on the fire to test it, and it billowed into a yellow cloud that burned Kevin's throat. Even through her mask, the clerk gasped for breath, and Alan over in her corner set up a continuous hacking Kivern had expected. The smell of bad eggs to disperse in a few minutes. But the yellow smoke hung in the air like a pall. Burning their eyes, Mary ran outside, coughing into her apron, and Eloise took Hermione and Agnes up to the loft to escape it. Kivrin propped the manor door open and fanned the air with one of the kitchen cloths. And after a while the air cleared a little. Though her throat still felt parched, the clerk continued to cough. But Rosamond stopped and her pulse slowed, till Kivrin could scarcely feel it. I don't know what to do, Kevin said. Holding her hot, dry wrist, I've tried everything. Roach came in coughing. It's the sulfur, she said. Rosamond is worse. He looked at her and felt her pulse, and then went out again, and Kevin took. That is a good sign. He would not have left if Rosamond were truly bad. He came back in a few minutes, wearing his vestments, and carrying the oil and viaticum of the last rites. What is it, Kevin said. Has the steward's wife died then? Nay, he said, and looked past her at Rosamond. Number, Kevin said. She scrambled to her feet, to stand between him and Rosamond. I won't let you. She must not die unshriven, he said, still looking at Rosamond. Rosamond isn't dying, Kevin said, and followed his gaze. She looked already dead, her chapped lips half open, and her eyes blind and unblinking. Her skin had taken on a yellowish cast, and was stretched tautly over her narrow face. No, Kivrin thought desperately. I must do something to stop this. She's 12 years old. Roach moved forward with the chalice, and Rosamond raised her arm as if in supplication, and then let it fall. We must open the plague boil. Kevin said we must let the poison out. She thought he was going to refuse, to insist on hearing Rosamond's confession first, but he didn't. He set the chrism and chalice down on the stone floor, and went to fetch a knife, a sharp one. Kevin called after him, and bring wine. She set the pot of water on the fire again. When he came back with the knife, she washed it off with water from the bucket, scrubbed the encrusted dirt near the hilt. With her fingernails she held it in the fire, the hilt wrapped in the tail of her surcoat, and then poured boiling water over it, and then wine, and then the water again. They moved Rosamond closer to the fire, the side with the bubo facing it, so they could have as much light as possible, and Roach knelt at Rosamond's head. Kivrin slipped her arm gently out of her shift and bunched the fabric under her for a pillow. Roach took hold of her arm, turning it so the swelling was exposed. It was almost the size of an apple, and her whole shoulder joint was inflamed and swollen. The edges of the bubo were soft and almost gelatinous, but the center was still hard. Kevin opened the bottle of wine Roach had brought, poured some on a cloth, and swabbed the bugle gently with it. It felt like a rock embedded in the skin. She was not sure the knife would even cut into it. She picked up the knife and poised it above the swelling, afraid of cutting into an artery, of spreading the infection, of making it worse. She is past pain, Roach said. Kevin looked down at her. She hadn't moved. even when Kevin pressed on. The swelling, she stared past them both at something terrible. I can't make it worse, Kevin thought. Even if I kill her, I can't make it worse. Hold her arm, she said. And Roach pinned her wrist and halfway up the forearm, pressing her arm flat to the floor. Rosamund still didn't move. To quick, clean slices, Kevin thought. She took a deep breath and touched the knife to the swelling. Rosamund's arm spasmed, her shoulder twisting protectively away from the knife, her thin hand clenching into a claw. "What do you do?" she said hoarsely. "I will tell my father." Kevin jerked the knife back. Roach caught at Rosamund's arm and pushed it back against the floor, and she hit weakly at him with her other hand. "I am the daughter of Lord Guillaume de Lavergue," she said. "You cannot treat me thus." Kevin scooted out of her reach and scrambled to her feet, trying to keep the knife from touching anything. Roach reached forward and caught both her wrists easily in one hand. Rosamund kicked out weakly at Kevin. The chalice fell over, and wine spilled out in a dark puddle. "We must tie her," Kivrin said, and realized she was holding the knife aloft. Like a murderer, she wrapped it in one of the cloths. Eloise had torn and ripped another into strips. Rosham bound Rosamund's wrists above her head, while Kivrin tied her ankles to the leg of one of the upturned benches. Rosamund didn't struggle, but when Roach pulled her shift up over her exposed chest, she said, "I know. You are the cutthroat who waylaid the Lady Catherine." Roach leaned forward, pressing his full weight down on her forearm, and Kivrin cut across the swelling. Blood oozed and then gushed, and Kevin thought, "I've hit an artery." She and Roach both lunged for the pile of cloths, and she grabbed a thick wad of them and pressed them against the wound. They soaked through immediately, and when she released her hand to take the one Roach handed her, blood spurted out of the tiny cut. She jammed the tail of her surcoat against it, and Rosamund whimpered a small, helpless sound like Inez's puppy, and seemed to collapse, though there was nowhere for her to fall. "I've killed her," Kevin thought. "I can't stop the bleeding," she said, but it had already stopped. She held the skirt of her surcoat against it, counting to 100 and then to 100, and carefully lifted a corner of it away from the wound. Blood still welled from the cut, but it was mixed with a thick yellow, gray pus. Roach leaned forward to dab at it, but Kivrin stopped him. "No. It's full of plague germs," she said, taking the cloth away from him. "Don't touch it." She wiped a sickening-looking pus away. It oozed up again, followed by a watery serum. "That's all of it, I think," she said to Roach. "Hand me the wine." She looked round for a clean cloth to pour it on. There weren't any. They had used them all trying to stop the bleeding. She tipped the wine bottle carefully and let the dark liquid dribble into the cut. Rosamund didn't move. Her face was gray, as if all the blood had been drained out of her. "As it had been, and I don't have a transfusion to give her. I don't even have a clean rag." Roach was untying Rosamund's hands. He took her limp hand in his huge one. "Her heart beats strongly now," he said. "We must have more linen." Hieronymus said, and burst into tears. "My father will see you hang for this," Rosamund said. Transcript from the Doomsday Book. "Rosamund is unconscious. I tried to lance her bubo last night to drain out the infection, and I'm afraid I only made things worse. She lost a great deal of blood. She's very pale and her pulse is so faint. I can't find it in her wrist at all. The clerk is worse too. His skin continues to hemorrhage, and it's clear he's near the end. I remember Dr. Aaron saying, untreated, bubonic plague kills people in 4 or 5 days. But he can't possibly last that long. Lady Eloise, Lady Amani, and Agnes are still well, though. Lady Amani seems to have gone almost insane in her search for someone to blame. She boxed Macy's ears this morning and told her God was punishing us all for her laziness and stupidity. Maisry is lazy and stupid. She cannot be trusted to watch Agnes for 5 minutes at a time. And when I sent her for water to wash Rosamund's wound this morning, She was gone over half an hour and came back without it. I didn't say anything. I didn't want Lady Amani hitting her again, and it is only a matter of time before Lady Amani gets around to blaming me. I saw her watching me over her book of hours. When I went out for the water, Maisie forgot, and I can well imagine what she's thinking. That I know too much about the plague not to have been fleeing it. That I am supposed to have lost my memory. That I was not injured but ill if she makes those accusations. I'm afraid she convinced Lady Eloise that I'm the cause of the plague, and that she shouldn't listen to me, that they should take the barricade down and pray together for God to deliver them. And how will I defend myself? By saying I'm from the future, where we know everything about the Black Death, except how to cure it without streptomycin, and how to get back there. Garwin still isn't back. Eloise is frantic with worry. When Roach went to save Vespers, she was standing at the gate. No cloak, no coif, watching the road. I wonder if it has occurred to her that he might already have been infected when he left for Bath. He rode to course with the bishop's envoy, and when he came back, he already knew about the plague break. Alf the Reeve is near death, and his wife and one of his sons have it. No buboes, but the woman has several small lumps, like seeds inside her thigh. Roach constantly has to be reminded to wear his mask, and to not touch the patients more than he has to, the history vids say. The contempts were panic-stricken and cowardly during the Black Death, that they ran away and wouldn't tend the sick, and that the priests were the worst of all. But it isn't like that at all. Everyone's frightened. But they're all doing the best they can, and Roach is wonderful. He sat and held the Reeves' wife's hand the whole time I examined her, and he doesn't flinch at the most disgusting jobs. Bathing Rosamond's wound, emptying chamber pots, cleaning up after the clerk. He never seems afraid. I don't know where he gets his courage, he continues to say. Matins and Vespers and to pray, telling God about Rosamond and who has it now, reporting their symptoms and telling what we're doing for them, as if he could actually hear him the way I talk to you. Is God there too, I wonder, but shut off from us by something worse than time? Unable to get through, unable to find us. Break, we can hear the plague. The villagers toll the death knell after a burial. 9 strokes for a man, 3 for a woman, 1 for a baby, and then an hour of steady tolling. Escott had to this morning, and Osney has tolled continuously since yesterday, the bell in the southwest that I told you I could hear when I first came through has stopped. I don't know whether that means the plague is finished there, or whether there's no one left alive to ring the bell. Break, please don't let Rosamond die. Please don't let Agnes get it, send Garwin back. Chapter 28. The boy who had run from Kevin the day she tried to find the drop came down with the plague in the night. His mother was standing, waiting for Father Roach when he went to Matins. The boy had a bub on his back, and Kevin glanced at. While Roach and the mother held him, she didn't want to do it. The scurvy had left him already weak, and Kevin had no idea whether there were any arteries below the shoulder blades. Rosamond did not seem at all improved, though Roach claimed her pulse was stronger. She was so white, as if she'd been utterly drained of blood, and so still. And the boy didn't look as if he could stand to lose any blood, but he bled hardly at all, and the color was already coming back in his cheeks before Kivrin finished washing the knife. Give him tea made from rose hips, Kevin said, thinking that at least that would help the scurvy and willow bark. She held the blade of the knife over the fire. The fire was no bigger than the day she had sat by it, too weak to find the drop. It would never keep the boy warm, and if she told the woman to go gather firewood, she might expose someone else. We will bring you some wood, she said, and then wondered how there was still food left over from the Christmas feast. But they were fast running out of everything else. They had used most of the wood that was already cut. Trying to keep Rosamond and the clerk warm, and there was no one to ask to chop the logs. That lay piled against the kitchen. The reeve was ill. The steward was tending his wife and son. Kevin gathered up an armful of the already split wood and some pieces of loose bark for kindling, and took it back to the hut, wishing she could move the boy into the manor house. But Eloise had the clerk and Rosamond attend, and she looked ready to collapse herself. Eloise had sat with Rosamond all night, giving her sips of willow tea and rebandaging the wound. They had run out of cloths, and she had taken off her coif and torn it into strips. She sat where she could see the screens, and every few minutes she had stood up and gone over to the door, as if she heard someone coming, with her dark hair down over her shoulders. She looked no older than Rosamond. Kevin took the firewood to the woman, dumping it on the dirt floor next to the rat cage. The rat was gone, killed, no doubt, and not even guilty. "The Lord blesses us," the woman said to her. She knelt by the fire and began carefully adding the wood to it. Kivrin checked the boy again. His bubo was still draining, a clear watery fluid, which was good. Rosamond had bled half the night, and then began to swell and grow hard again, and I can't lance it again. Kivrin thought she can't lose any more blood. She started back to the hall, wondering if she should relieve Eloise or try to chop some wood. Roach, coming out of the steward's house, met her with the news that two more of the steward's children were ill. It was the two youngest boys, and it was clearly the pneumonic. Both were coughing, and the mother intermittently retched a watery sputum. "The Lord blesses us." Kevin went back to the hall. It was still hazy from the sulfur, and the clerk's arms looked almost black in the yellowish light. The fire was no better than the one in the woman's hut. Kevin brought in the last of the cut wood, and then told Eloise to lie down, that she would tend Rosamond nay. Eloise said, glancing toward the door. She added almost to herself, "He has been 3 days on the road." It was 70 kilometers to Bath a day, and a half at least on horseback, and the same amount of time back. If he had been able to get a fresh horse in Bath, he might be back today if he had found Lord Guillaume immediately. If he comes back, Kevin thought. Eloise glanced at the door again, as if she heard something, but the only sound was Agnes crooning softly to her cart. She had put a kerchief over it like a blanket, and was spooning make-believe food into it. "He has the blue sickness," she told Kivrin. Kivrin spent the rest of the day doing household chores, bringing in water, making broth from the roast joint, emptying the chamber pots, the steward's cow, its udders swollen in spite of Kivrin's orders, came lowing into the courtyard and followed her, nudging her with its horns, till Kivrin gave up and milked it. Roach chopped wood in between visits to the steward and the boy, and Kevin, wishing she had learned how to split wood, hacked clumsily at the big logs. The steward came to fetch them again just before dark, to his younger daughter. "That's 8 cases so far," Kevin thought. There were only 40 people in the village. 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe was supposed to have caught the plague and died, and Mr. Gilchrist thought that was exaggerated. 1/3 would be 13 cases, only 5 more. Even at 50%, only 12 more would get it. And the steward's children had all already been exposed. She looked at them, the older daughter, stocky and dark like her father, the youngest boy, sharp-faced like his mother, the scrawny baby. "You'll all get it," she thought, "and that will leave 8. She couldn't seem to feel anything, even when the baby began to cry, and the girl took it on her knee and stuck her filthy finger in its mouth. 13, she prayed, 20 at the most. She couldn't feel anything for the clerk either, even though it was clear he could not last the night. His lips and tongue were covered with a brown slime, and he was coughing up a watery spittle that was streaked with blood. She tended him automatically without feeling. "It's the lack of sleep," she thought. "It's making us all numb." She lay down by the fire and tried to sleep, but she seemed beyond sleep. beyond tiredness. 8 more people, she thought. Adding them up in her mind, the mother will catch it. And the Reeves wife and children, that leaves 4. Don't let one of them be Agnes or Eloise or Roach. In the morning, Roach found the cook, lying in the snow in front of her hut, half frozen and coughing blood. 9. Kevin thought the cook was a widow, with no one to take care of her, so they brought her into the hall and laid her next to the clerk, who was amazingly horribly still alive. The hemorrhaging had spread all over his body now, his chest crisscrossed with bluish-purple marks, his arms and legs nearly solid black. His cheeks were covered with a black stubble that seemed somehow a symptom too, and under it his face was darkening. Rosamond still lay white and silent, balanced between life and death, and Eloise tended her quietly, carefully, as if the slightest movement, the slightest sound might tip her into death. Kevin tiptoed among the pallets, and Agnes, sensing the need for silence, fell completely apart. She whined. She hung on the barricade. She asked Kevin 6 times to take her, to see her hound her pony, to get her something to eat, to finish telling her the story of the naughty girl in the woods. How does it end? She whined in a tone that set Kevin's teeth on edge. Do the wolves eat the girl? I don't know, Kevin snapped after the 4th time. Go and sit by your grandmother. Agnes looked contemptuously at Lady Amani, who still knelt in the corner, her back to all of them. She had been there all night. Grandmother will not play with me. Well then, play with Maisie. She did for 5 minutes, pestering her so mercilessly she retaliated, and Agnes came screaming back, shrieking that Maisie had pinched her. I don't blame her, Kivrin said, and sent both of them to the loft. She went to check on the boy, who was so improved he was sitting up, and when she came back, Maisry was hunched in the high seat, sound asleep. Where's Agnes? Kevin said. Eloise looked around blankly. I know not. They were in the loft. Maisry, Kevin said, crossing to the dais. Wake up, where's Agnes? Mazzy blinked stupidly at her. You should not have left her alone. Kevin said she climbed up into the loft, but Agnes wasn't there, so she checked the bower. She wasn't there either. Mazzy had got out of the high seat and was huddled against the wall, looking terrified. Where is she? Kivrin demanded. Maisry put her hand up defensively to her ear and gaped at her. That's right, Kivrin said. I will box your ears unless you tell me where she is. Maisry buried her face in her skirts. Where is she? Kevin said, and jerked her up by the arm. You were supposed to watch her. She was your responsibility. Maisry began to howl, a high-pitched sound like an animal. Stop that, Kevin said. Show me where she went. She pushed her toward the screens. What is it? Roach said. Coming in, it's Agnes. Kevin said we must find her. She may have gone to the village. Roach shook his head. I didn't see her. She is likely in one of the outbuildings, the stables, Kevin said. Relieved, she said she wanted to go see her pony. She was not in the stables. Agnes, she called into the manure. Smelling darkness. Agnes, Agnes pony whinnied and tried to push its way out of its stall, and Kevin wondered when it had last been fed and where the hounds were. Agnes, she looked in each of the boxes and behind the manger. Anywhere a little girl might hide or fall asleep. She might be in the barn, Kevin thought, and came out of the stable, shielding her eyes from the sudden brightness. Roach was just emerging from the kitchen. Did you find her? Kevin asked. But he didn't hear her. He was looking toward the gate, his head cocked as if he were listening. Kevin listened, but she couldn't hear anything. What is it? She asked. Can you hear her crying? It is the Lord, he said, and ran toward the gate. Oh no. Not Roach, Kevin thought, and ran after him. He had stopped and was opening the gate. Father Roach, Kevin said, and heard the horse. It was galloping toward them, the sound of the hoofs loud on the frozen ground. Kivrin thought Roach meant the lord of the manor. He thinks Eloise's husband has finally come, and then with a shock of hope, it's Mr. Dunworthy. Roach lifted the heavy bar and slid it to the side. We need streptomycin and disinfectant. And he's got to take Rosamond back to hospital with him. She have to have a transfusion. Roach had the bar off. He pushed on the gate. And vaccine, she thought wildly. He'd better bring back the oral. Where's Agnes? He must get Agnes safely away from here. The horse was nearly at the gate. Before she came to her senses, no, she said, but it was too late. Roach already had the gate open. He can't come here, Kivrin shouted, looking about wildly for something to warn him off with. He'll catch the plague. She left the spade by the empty pigsty. After she buried Blackie, she ran to get it. Don't let him through the gate, she called, and Roach flung his arms up in warning. But he had already ridden into the courtyard. Roach dropped his arms. Garwin, he said. And the black stallion looked like Garwin's, but a boy was riding it. He could not have been older than Rosamond, and his face and clothes were streaked with mud. The stallion was muddy too, breathing hard and spattering foam, and the boy looked as winded. His nose and ears were brightened with the cold. He started to dismount, staring at them. You must not come here, Kevin said, speaking carefully so she wouldn't lapse into English. There's plague in this village. She raised her spade, pointing it like a gun at him. The boy stopped halfway off the horse and sat down in the saddle again. The blue sickness, she added, in case he didn't understand. But he was already nodding. It's everywhere, he said, turning to take something from the pouch behind his saddle. I bear a message. He held out a leather wallet toward Roach, and Roach stepped forward for it. No, Kevin said, and took a step forward, jabbing the spade at the air in front of him. Drop it on the ground, she said. You must not touch us. The boy took a tied roll of vellum from the wallet and threw it at Roach's feet. Roach picked it up off the flagstones and unrolled it. What says the message? He asked the boy, and Kevin thought, of course he can't read. I know not, the boy said. It's from the Bishop of Bath. I'm to take it to all the parishes. Would you have me read it? Kevin asked. Mayhap it is from the Lord, Roach said. Mayhap he sends word that he has been delayed. Yes, Kevin said, taking it from him, but she knew it wasn't. It was in Latin, printed in letters so elaborate. They were hard to read, but it didn't matter. She had read it before in the Bodleian. She leaned the spade against her shoulder and read the message, translating the Latin. The contagious pestilence of the present day, which is spreading far and wide, has left many parish churches and other livings in our diocese without parson or priest to care for their parishioners. She looked at Roach. No, she thought, not here. I won't let that happen here, since no priests can be found who are willing. The priests were dead or had run away, and no one could be persuaded to take their place. And the people were dying without the sacrament of penance. She read on, seeing not the black letters, but the faded brown ones she had deciphered in the Bodleian. She had thought the letter was pompous and ridiculous. People were dying right and left, she had told Mr. Dunworthy indignantly. And all the bishop was concerned about was church protocol. But now, reading it to the exhausted boy and Father Roach, it sounded exhausted too, and desperate. If they are on the point of death and cannot secure the services of a priest, she read, then they should make confession to each other. We urge you, by these present letters in the bowels of Jesus Christ, to do this. Neither the boy nor Roach said anything. When she had finished reading, she wondered if the boy had known what he was carrying. She rolled the vellum up and handed it back to him. I have been riding 3 days, the boy said, slumping forward tiredly in the saddle. Can I not rest here a while? It's not safe, Kevin said, feeling sorry for him. We will give you and your horse food to take with you. Roach turned to go into the kitchen, and Givrin suddenly remembered Agnes. Did you see a little girl on the road? She asked, a 5-year-old child with a red cloak and hood. Nay, the boy said, but there are many on the roads. They flee the pestilence. Roach was bringing out a wadmal sack Kivrin turned to fetch some oats for the stallion, and Eloise shot past them both, her skirts tangling between her legs, her loose hair flying out behind her. "Don't!" Kivrin shouted, but Eloise had already caught hold of the stallion's bridle. "Where do you come from?" she asked, grabbing at the boy's sleeve. "Have you seen August, my husband's prelate, Garwin?" The boy looked frightened. "I come from Bath with a message from the bishop," he said, pulling back on the reins. The horse whinnied and tossed its head. "What message?" Eloise said hysterically. "Is it from Garwin?" "I do not know the man of whom you speak." The boy said, "Lady Aloysie," Kivrin said, stepping forward. "Gavin rides a black steed with a saddle, chased in silver," Eloise persisted, pulling on the stallion's bridle. "He has gone to Bath to fetch my husband, who witnesses at the assizes." "None go to Bath," the boy said. "All who can flee it." Eloise stumbled as though the stallion had reared and seemed to fall against its side. "There is no court nor any law," the boy said. "The deadline. The streets and all who but look on them die too. Some say it is the end of the world." Eloise let go of the bridle and took a step back. She turned and looked hopefully at Kivrin and Roach. "They will surely be home soon then. Is it certain you did not see them on the road?" "He rides a black steed. There were many steeds." He kicked the horse forward toward Roach, but Eloise didn't move. Roach stepped forward with a sack of food. The boy leaned down, grabbed it, and wheeled a stallion around, nearly running Eloise down. She didn't try to get out of the way. Kevin stepped forward and caught hold of one of the reins. "Don't go back to the bishop," she said. He jerked up on the reins, looking more frightened of her than of Eloise. "She didn't let go north," she said. "The plague isn't there yet." He wrenched the reins free, kicked the stallion forward, and galloped out of the courtyard. "Stay off the main roads." Kevin called after him, "Speak to no one." Eloise still stood where she was. "Come," Kevin said to her, "we must find Agnes. My husband and Garwin will have ridden first to Courcy to warn Sir Bloet," she said, and let Kevin lead her back to the house. Kevin left her by the fire and went to look in the barn. Agnes wasn't there, but she found her own cloak left there Christmas Eve. She flung it around her and went up into the loft. She looked in the brewhouse, and Roach searched the other buildings, but they didn't find her. A cold wind had sprung up while they stood talking to the messenger, and it smelled like snow. "Perhaps she is in the house," Roach said. "Look you behind the high seat." She searched the house again, looking behind the high seat and under the bed in the bower. Mary still lay whimpering where Kivrin had left her, and she had to resist the temptation to kick her. She asked Lady Amani, kneeling to the wall, if she had seen Agnes or not. The old woman ignored her, moving her links of chain and her lips silently. Kevin shook her shoulder. "Did you see her go out?" Lady Amaryllis turned and looked at her, her eyes glittering. "She is to blame," she said. "Agnes," Kivrin said, outraged. "How could it be her fault?" Amani shook her head and looked past Kivrin at Maisry. "God punishes us for Maisry's wickedness. Agnes is missing and it grows dark." Kivrin said, "We must find her." "Did you not see where she went to blame?" she whispered, and turned back to the wall. It was getting late now, and the wind was whistling around the screens. Kevin ran out to the passage and onto the green. It was like the day she had tried to find the drop on her own. There was no one on the snow-covered green, and the wind whipped and tore at her clothes as she ran. A bell was ringing somewhere far off to the northeast. Slowly a funeral toll. Agnes had loved the bell tower. Kevin went in and shouted Agnes's name, even though she could see up to the bell rope. She went out and stood looking at the huts, trying to think where Agnes would have gone. Not the huts unless she had got cold. Her puppy. She had wanted to go see her puppy's grave. Kivrin hadn't told her she'd buried it in the woods. Agnes had told her it had to be buried in the churchyard. Kivrin could see she wasn't there, but she went through the lich gate. Agnes had been there. The prints of her little boots LED from grave to grave, and then off to the north side of the church. Kevin looked up the hill at the beginnings of the woods, thinking, what if she went into the woods? We'll never find her. She ran around the side of the church. The prince stopped and circled back to the church. Kevin opened the door. It was nearly dark inside, and colder than the wind-whipped churchyard. "Agnes," she called. There was no answer, but there was a faint sound up by the altar, like a rat scurrying out of sight. "Agnes," Kevin said, peering into the gloom behind the tomb in the side aisles. "Are you here?" she said. "Kevin," a quavering little voice said. "Agnes," she said, and ran in its direction. "Where are you?" She was by the statue of Saint Catherine, huddled among the candles at its base, in her red cape and hood. She had pressed herself against the rough stone skirts of the statue, eyes wide and frightened. Her face was red and damp with tears. "Kevin," she cried and flung herself into arms. "What are you doing here, Agnes?" Kevin said, angry with relief. She hugged her tightly. "We've been looking everywhere for you." She buried her wet face against Kevin's neck, hiding. She said, "I took cart to see my hound and I fell down." She wiped at her nose with her hand. "I called and called for you, but you didn't come. I didn't know where you were, honey," Kevin said, stroking her hair. "Why did you come in the church?" "I was hiding from the wicked man." "What wicked man?" Kevin said, frowning. The heavy church door opened, and Agnes clasped her little arms in a stranglehold around Kevin's neck. "It is the wicked man," she whispered hysterically. "Father Roach," Kevin called. "I found her. She's here." The door shut and she could hear his footsteps. "It's Father Roach," she said to Agnes. "He's been looking for you too. We didn't know where you'd gone." She loosened her grip a little. "Macy said the wicked man would come and get me." Roach came up panting, and Agnes buried her head against Kevin again. "Is she ill?" he asked anxiously. "I don't think so," Kevin said. "She's half frozen. Put my cloak over her." Roach clumsily unfastened Kevin's cloak and wrapped it around Agnes. "I hid from the wicked man," Agnes said to him, turning in Kevin's arms. "What wicked man?" Roach said. "The wicked man who chased you in the church," she said. Maisie said, "He comes and gets you and gives you the blue sickness." "There isn't any wicked man," Kevin said, thinking. "I'll shake Maisie till her teeth rattle when I get home." She stood up. Agnes's grip tightened. Roach groped along the wall to the priest's door and opened it. Bluish light flooded in. "Maisie said he got my hound," Agnes said, shivering. "But he didn't get me. I hid." Kevin thought of the black puppy limp in her hands, blood around its mouth. "No," she thought, and started rapidly across the snow. She was shivering because she'd been in the icy church so long. Her face felt hot against Kevin's neck. "It's only from crying," Kevin told herself, and asked her if her head ached. Agnes shook or nodded her head against Kevin and wouldn't answer no. Kevin thought and walked faster. Roach closed behind her, past the Stewart's house and into the courtyard. "I didn't go in the woods," Agnes said. "When they got to the house, the naughty girl did, didn't she?" "Yes," Kevin said, carrying her over to the fire. "But it was all right. The father found her and took her home, and they lived happily ever after." She sat Agnes down on the bench and untied her cape, and she never went in the woods again, she said. She never did. Kevin pulled her wet shoes and hose off. "You must lie down," she said, spreading her cloak next to the fire. "I will bring you some hot soup." Agnes lay down obediently, and Kevin pulled the sides of the cloak up over her. She brought her soup, but Agnes didn't want any, and she fell asleep almost immediately. "She's caught a chill," she told Eloise and Roach almost fiercely. "She was outside all afternoon. She's caught cold." But after Roach left to save Aspis, she uncovered Agnes and felt under her arms, in her groin. She even turned her over, looking for a lump between the shoulder blades. Like the boys, Roach didn't ring a bell. He came back with a ragged quilt that was obviously from his own bed. made it into a pallet and moved Agnes onto it. The other Vespers bells were ringing. Oxford and Godstow, and the bell from the southwest. Kevin couldn't hear Corsi's double bell. She looked at Eloise anxiously, but she didn't seem to be listening. She was looking across Rosamond at the screens. The bells stopped and courses started up. They sounded odd, muffled and slow. Kevin looked at Roach. "Is it a funeral bell?" "Nay," he said, looking at Agnes. "It is a holy day." She had lost track of the days. The bishop's envoy had left Christmas morning, and in the afternoon, she had found out it was the plague. And after that it seemed like one endless day. For days, she thought, it's been for days. She had wanted to come at Christmas because there were so many holy days. Even the peasants would know what day it was. And she couldn't possibly miss the rendezvous. Garwin went to Bath for help, Mr. Dunworthy, she thought. And the bishop took all the horses, and I didn't know where it was. Eloise had stood up and was listening to the bells. "Are those Corse's bells?" she asked Roach. "Yes," he said. "Fear not, it is the slaughter of the innocents." The slaughter of the innocents, Kevin thought, looking at Agnes. She was asleep and she had stopped shivering. Though she still felt hot, the cook cried out something, and Kivrin went around the barricade to her. She was crouched on her pallet, struggling to get up. "Must go home," she said. Kivrin coaxed her down again and fetched her a drink of water. The bucket was nearly empty, and she picked it up and started out with it. "Tell Kevin I would have her come to me." Agnes said she was sitting up. Kevin put the bucket down. "I'm here," Kevin said, kneeling down beside her. "I'm right here." Agnes looked at her, her face red and distorted with rage. "The wicked man will get me if Kivrin does not come," she said. "Bid her come now." Transcript from the Doomsday Book. "I've missed the rendezvous. I lost count of the days taking care of Rosamond, and I couldn't find Agnes, and I didn't know where the drop was. You must be worried sick, Mr. Dunworthy. You probably think I've fallen among cutthroats and murderers. Well, I have, and now they've got Agnes. She has a fever but no buboes. And she isn't coughing or vomiting, just the fever. It's very high. She doesn't know me and keeps calling me to come. Roach and I tried to bring it down by sponging her with cold compresses, but it keeps going back up. Break. Lady Amani has it. Father Roach found her this morning on the floor. In the corner. She may have been there all night. The last 2 nights she has refused to go to bed and has stayed on her knees, praying to God to protect her and the rest of the godly from the plague. He hasn't. She has the pneumonic. She's coughing and vomiting, mucus streaked with blood. She won't let Roach or me tend her. She is to blame for this," she told Roach, pointing at me. "Look at her hair. She is no maid. Look at her clothes. My clothes are a boy's jerkin and leather hose I found in one of the chests in the loft. My kerchief got ruined when Lady Amani vomited on me, and I had to tear my shift up for cloths and bandages." Roach tried to give Hermione some of the willow bark tea, but she spat it out, she said. She lied when she said she was waylaid in the woods. She was sent here to kill us. Bloody spittle dribbled down her chin as she spoke, and Roach wiped it off. "It is the disease that makes you believe these things," he said gently. "She was sent here to poison us," Hermione said. "See how she has poisoned my son's children, and now she would poison me. But I will not let her give me aught to eat or drink." "Hush," Roach said sternly. "You must not speak ill of one who seeks to help you." She shook her head, turning it wildly from side to side. "She seeks to kill us all. You must burn her. She is the devil's servant. I've never seen him angry before." He looked almost like a cutthroat again. "You know not whereof you speak." He said, "It is God who has sent her to help us. I wish it were true that I were of any help at all. But I'm not." Agnes screams for me to come, and Rosamond lies there as if she were under a spell, and the clock is turning black. And there's nothing I can do to help any of them. Nothing. Break. All the Stewart's family have it. The youngest boy, a freak, was the only one with a blue bow. And I brought him in here and launched it. There's nothing I can do for the others. They all have mnemonic. Break. Stuart's baby is dead. Break. The Corsi bells are tolling. 9 strokes. Which one of them is it? The bishop's envoy. The fat monk who helped steal our horses. Also blow it. I hope so. Break. Terrible day. The steward's wife and the boy who ran from me. When I went to find the drop, both died this afternoon. The steward is digging both their graves, though the ground is so frozen. I don't see how he can even make a dent in it. Rosamond and Lafric are both worse. Rosamond can scarcely swallow, and her pulse is thready and irregular. Agnes is not as bad, but I can't get her fever down. Roach said Vespa's in here tonight after the set prayers. He said, "Good Jesus, I know you have sent what help you can, but I fear it cannot prevail against this dark plague. Thy holy servant Catherine says, this terror is a disease, but how can it be? For it does not move from man to man, but is everywhere at once. It is, break. Alf the Reeve is dead also. Sibby, daughter of the steward Joan, daughter of the steward the cook, I don't know her name. Walthoff, oldest son of the steward. Break. Over 50% of the village has it. Please don't let Alois get it. Aroche, chapter 29. He called for help, but no one came. And he thought that everyone else had died, and he was the only one left. Like the monk John Klin, in the monastery of the Friars Minor, I waiting for death till it come. He tried to press the button to call the nurse, but he couldn't find it. There was a hand bell on the bedstand next to the bed, and he reached for it, but there was no strength in his fingers, and it clattered to the floor. It made a horrible, endless sound, like some nightmarish great tom, but nobody came. The next time he woke, though, the bell was on the bedstand again. So they must have come while he was asleep. He squinted blurrily at the bell and wondered how long he had been asleep. A long time. There was no way to tell from the room. It was light, but there was no angle to the light. No shadows. It might be afternoon or mid-morning. There was no digital on the bedstand or the wall, and he didn't have the strength to turn and look at the screens on the wall behind him. There was a window, though. He could not raise himself up enough to see properly out of it, but he could see it was raining. It had been raining when he went to Brasnost. It could be the same afternoon. Perhaps he had only fainted, and they had brought him here for observation. I also will do this unto you, someone said. Dunworthy opened his eyes and reached for his spectacles, but they weren't there. I will even appoint over you terror, consumption, and burning ague. It was Mrs. Gadsden. She was sitting in the chair beside his bed, reading from the Bible. She was not wearing her mask and gown, though the Bible still seemed to be swathed in polythene. Dunworthy squinted at it. And when ye are gathered together within your cities, I will send the pestilence among you. What day is it? Dunworthy asked. She paused, looking curiously at him, and then went on placidly. And they shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. He could not have been here very long. Mrs. Gadsden had been reading to the patients. When he went to see Bidry, perhaps it was still the same afternoon, and Mary had not come in to throw Mrs. Gadsden out yet. Can you swallow? The nurse said. It was the ancient sister from supplies. I need to give you a temp. She croaked, can you swallow? He opened his mouth, and she put the temp capsule on his tongue. She tipped his head forward so he could drink, her apron crackling. Did you get it down? She asked, letting him lean back a bit. The capsule was lodged halfway down his throat, but he nodded. The effort made his head ache. Good, then I can remove this. She stripped something from his upper arm. What time is it? He asked, trying not to cough up the capsule. Time for you to rest, she said, peering farsightedly at the screens behind his head. What day is it? He said, but she had already hobbled out. What day is it? He asked Mrs. Gadsden, but she was gone too. He could not have been here long. He still had a headache and a fever. which were early symptoms of influenza. Perhaps he had only been ill a few hours. Perhaps it was still the same afternoon, and he had awakened when they moved him into the room. Before they had time to connect a call button or give him a temp, "Time for your temp," the nurse said. It was a different one, the pretty blonde nurse, who had asked him all the questions about William Gadsden. "I've already had one. That was yesterday," she said. "Come now, let's have it down." The first-year student in Beatrice's room had told him she was down with the virus. "I thought you had the virus," he said. "I did. But I'm well again, and so shall you be." She put a hand behind his head and raised him up so he could take a sip of water. "What day is it?" he asked. "The 11th," she said. I had to think a bit there. At the end, things got a bit hectic. Nearly all the staff were down with it, and everyone working double shifts. I quite lost track of the days. She typed something into the console and looked up at the screens, frowning. He had already known it before, she told him, before he tried to reach the bell to call for help. The fever had made one endless rainy afternoon out of all the delirious nights and drugged mornings. He could not remember, but his body had kept clear track of the time, tolling off the hours, the days, so that he had known even before she told him. He had missed the rendezvous. There was no rendezvous, he told himself bitterly. Gilchrist shot down the net. It would not have mattered if he had been there. If he had not been ill, the net was closed, and there was nothing he could have done. January the 11th. How long had Kevin waited at the drop? A day, 2 days, 3 before she began to think she had the date wrong, or the place. Had she waited all night by the Oxford Bath Road, huddled in her useless white cloak, afraid to build a fire for fear the light would attract wolves or thieves or peasants fleeing from the plague? And when had it come to her finally that no one was coming to get her? "Is there anything I can fetch for you?" the nurse asked. She pushed a syringe into the cannula. "Is that something to make me sleep?" He asked. "Yes." "Good," he said, and closed his eyes gratefully. He slept either a few minutes or a day or a month. The light, the rain, the lack of shadows were the same when he woke. Colin was sitting in the chair beside the bed, reading the book Dunworthy had given him for Christmas, and sucking on something. It can't have been that long, Dunworthy thought, squinting at him. The gobstopper is still with us. Oh, good, Colin said, shutting the book with a clap. That horrid sister said I could only stay if I promised not to wake you up. And I didn't, did I? You'll tell her you woke all on your own, won't you? He took the gobstopper out, examined it, and stuck it in his pocket. Have you seen her? She must have been alive during the Middle Ages. She's nearly as necrotic as Mrs. Gadsden. Dunworthy squinted at him. The jacket whose pocket he had stuck the gobstopper in was a new one, green, the gray plaid muffler round his neck, even grimmer against the verdure, and Colin looked older in it, as if he had grown while Dunworthy was asleep. Colin found. It's me, Colin. Do you know me? Yes, of course I know you. Why aren't you wearing your mask? Colin grinned. Don't have to, and at any rate, you're not contagious anymore. Do you want your spectacles? Dunworthy nodded carefully. So the aching wouldn't begin again when you woke up. The other times you didn't know me at all. He rummaged in the drawer of the bedstand and handed Dunworthy his spectacles. You were awfully bad. I thought you were going to pack it in. You kept calling me Kevin. What day is it? Dunworthy asked. The 12th, Colin said impatiently. You asked me that this morning. Don't you remember? Dunworthy put on his spectacles. No, don't you remember anything that's happened? I remember how I failed Kyvrin, he thought. I remember leaving her in 1348. Colin scooted the chair closer and laid the book on the bed. The sister told me you wouldn't because of the fever, Colin said, but he sounded faintly angry at Dunworthy, as if it were his fault. She wouldn't let me in to see you, and she wouldn't tell me anything. I think that's completely unfair. They make you sit in a waiting room and they keep telling you to go home. There's nothing you can do here. And when you ask questions, they say the doctor will be with you in a moment and won't tell you anything. They treat you like a child. I mean, you have to find out sometime, don't you? Do you know what Sister did this morning? She chucked me out. She said, "Mr. Dunworth is being very ill. I don't want you to upset him," as if I would. He looked indignant, but at the same time tired, worried. Dunworthy thought of him haunting the corridors and sitting in the waiting room, waiting for news. No wonder he looked older, and just now Mrs. Gadsden said I was only to tell you good news, because bad news would very likely make you have a relapse and die, and it would be my fault. Mrs. Gidson's still keeping up morale. I see. Dunworthy said. He smiled at Colin. "I don't suppose there's any chance of her coming down with the virus?" Colin looked astonished. "The epidemic stopped," he said. "They're lifting the quarantine next week." The analog had arrived then, after all Mary's pleading. He wondered if it had come in time to help Padre, and then wondered if that was the bad news. Mrs. Gadsden didn't want told. "I've already been told the bad news." He thought the fix is lost and Kevin is in 1348. "Tell me some good news," he said. "Well, nobody's fallen ill for 2 days," Colin said, "and the supplies finally came through, so we've something decent to eat." "You've got some new clothes as well, I see." Colin glanced down at the green jacket. "This is one of the Christmas presents from my mother. She sent them after." He stopped and frowned. "She sent me some vids in her set of face blasters as well." Dunworthy wondered if she had waited till after the epidemic was effectively over before bothering to ship Colin's gifts, and what Mary had had to say about it. "See," Colin said, standing up. "The jacket strips up automatically. You just touch the button like this. You won't have to tell me to strip it up anymore." The sister came rustling in. "Did he wake you up?" she demanded. "I told you so," Colin muttered. "I didn't, sister. I was so quiet you couldn't even hear me turn the pages. He didn't wake me up, and he's not bothering me," Dunworthy said before she could ask her next question. "He's telling me only good news." "You shouldn't be telling Mr. Dunworthy anything. He must rest," she said, and hung a bag of clear liquid on the drip. "Mr. Dunworthy is still too ill to be bothered with visitors." She hustled Colin out of the room. "If you're so worried over visitors, why don't you stop Mrs. Gadsden reading scripture to him?" Colin protested. "She'd make anybody ill." He stopped short at the door, glaring at the sister. "I'll be back tomorrow. Is there anything you'd like?" "How is Bardry?" Dunworthy asked and braced himself for the answer. "Better," Colin said. "He was almost well, but he had a relapse. He's a good deal better now, though. He wants to see you." "No," Dunworthy said, but the sister had already shut the door. "It's not Bardier's fault," Mary had said, and of course it wasn't. Disorientation was one of the early symptoms. He thought of himself, unable to punch in Andrew's number of Mrs. Pontini, making mistake after mistake on the handbells, murmuring sorry over and over. "Sorry," he murmured. It had not been Bettery's fault, it was his. He had been so worried about the apprentice's calculations that he had infected Bettery with his fears, so worried that Bettery had decided to refeed the coordinates. Colin had left his book lying on the bed. Dunworthy pulled it toward him. It seemed impossibly heavy, so heavy. His arms shook with the effort of holding it open. But he propped the side against the rail and turned the pages, almost unreadable from the angle he was lying at, till he found what he was looking for. The Black Death had hit Oxford at Christmas, shutting down the universities and causing those who were able to flee to the surrounding villages, carrying the plague with them. Those who couldn't died in the thousands. So many there were none left to keep possession or make up a competent number to bury the dead. And the few who were left barricaded themselves inside the colleges, hiding and looking for someone to blame. He fell asleep with his spectacles on, but when the nurse removed them, he woke. It was William's nurse, and she smiled at him. "Sorry," she said. putting them in the drawer. I didn't mean to wake you. Dunworthy squinted at her. Collins says the epidemic's over. Yes, she said. Looking at the screens behind him, they found the source of the virus and got the analog. All at the same time and only just in time. Probability was projecting an 85% morbidity rate, with 32% mortality even with antimicrobials and T-cell enhancement, and that was without adding in the supply shortage, and so many of the staff being down. As it was, we had nearly 19% mortality, and a good number of the cases are still critical. She picked up his wrist and looked at the screen behind his head. Your fever's down a bit, she said. You're very lucky, you know. The analog didn't work on anyone already infected. Dr. Ahrens, she said, and then stopped. He wondered what Mary had said, that he would pack it in. You're very lucky, she said again. Now try to sleep. He slept, and when he woke again, Mrs. Gadsden was standing over him, poised for attack with her Bible. He will bring upon thee all the diseases of Egypt, she said as soon as he had opened his eyes. Also every sickness and every plague, until thou be destroyed, and he shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. Dunworthy murmured what Mrs. Gadsden demanded. Nothing. She had lost her place. She flipped back and forth through the pages, searching for pestilences, and began reading. Because that God sent his only begotten Son into the world. God would never have sent him if he'd known what would happen, Dunworthy thought. Herod and the slaughter of the innocents and Gethsemane, read to me from St. Matthew. He said chapter 26 verse 39. Mrs. Gadsden stopped looking irritated, and then leafed through the pages to Matthew, and he went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, Oh, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. God didn't know where his Son was, Dunworthy thought. He had sent his only begotten Son into the world, and something had gone wrong with the fix. Someone had turned off the net, so that he couldn't get to him, and they had arrested him, and put a crown of thorns on his head, and nailed him to a cross. Chapter 27, he said. Verse 46, she pursed her lips and turned the page. I really do not feel these are appropriate scriptures for Rita, he said. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi lama sabachthani, that is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Kevin would have no idea what had happened. She would think she had the wrong place, or the wrong time, that she had lost count of the days. Somehow during the plague, that something had gone wrong with the drop. She would think they had forsaken her. Well, Mrs. Gadsden said. Any other requests? No. Mrs. Gadsden flipped back to the Old Testament. For they shall fall by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence, she read. He that is far off shall die of the pestilence. In spite of everything, he slept, waking finally to something that was not endless afternoon. It was still raining, but now there were shadows in the room, and the bells were chiming. For o'clock, William's nurse helped him to the lavatory. The book had gone, and he wondered if Colin had come back. Without his remembering, but when the nurse opened the door of the bedstand for his slippers, he saw it lying there. He asked the nurse to crank his bed to sitting, and when she had gone, he put on his spectacles and took the book out again. The plague had spread so randomly, so viciously, the contempts had been unable to believe it was a natural disease. They had accused lepers and old women, and the mentally impaired of poisoning wells and putting curses on them. Anyone strange, anyone foreign was immediately suspected. In Sussex they had stoned 2 travelers to death. In Yorkshire they had burned a young woman at the stake, so that's where it got to. Colin said coming into the room, I thought I'd lost it. He was wearing his green jacket and was very wet. I had to carry the handbell cases over to Holy Reformed for Miss Taylor, and it's absolutely pouring. Relief washed over him at the mention of Miss Taylor's name, and he realized he had not asked after any of the detainees. for fear it would be bad news. Is Miss Taylor all right? Then Colin touched the bottom of his jacket, and it sprang open, spraying water everywhere. Yes, they're doing some belting at Holy Reformed on the 15th. He leaned around so he could see what Dunworthy was reading. Dunworthy shut the book and handed it to him and the rest of the bell ringers. Miss Petoni. Colin nodded. She's still in hospital. She's so thin you wouldn't know her. He opened the book. You were reading about the Black Death, weren't you? Yes, Dunworthy said. Mr. Finch didn't come down with a virus, did he? No, he's been filling in as tenor for Miss Pontini. He's very upset. We didn't get any lavatory paper in the shipment from London, and he says we're nearly out. He had a fight with the gallstone over it. He laid the book back on the bed. What's going to happen to your girl? I don't know, Dunworthy said. Well, isn't there anything you can do to get her out? No, the Black Death was terrible. Colin said so many people died, they didn't even bury them. They just left them lying in big heaps. I can't get to her, Colin. We lost the fix when Gilchrist shut the net down. I know, but isn't there something we can do? No, but I intend to speak to your doctor about restricting your visitors, the sister said sternly, removing Colin by the collar of his jacket. Then begin by restricting Mrs. Gadsden, Dunworthy said, and tell Mary I want to see her. Mary didn't come, but Montoya did. Obviously fresh from the dig, she was mud to the knees, and her dark curly hair was gray with it. Colin came with her, and his green jacket was thoroughly bespattered. We had to sneak in when she wasn't looking. Colin said Montoya had lost a good deal of weight. Her hands on the bed rail were very thin, and the digit on her wrist was loose. How are you feeling? She asked. Better, he lied. Looking at her hands, there was mud under her fingernails. How are you feeling? Better, she said. She must have gone directly to the dig to look for the quarter as soon as they released her from hospital, and now she had come directly here. She is dead, isn't she? He said. Her hands took hold of the rail, let go of it. Yes, Kevin had been in the right place. After all, the locals had been shifted by only a few kilometers, a few meters, and she had managed to find the Oxford Bath Road. She had found Skendgate and died in it. A victim of the influenza she had caught before she went, or of starvation after the plague, or of despair. She had been dead 700 years. You found it then, he said, and it was not a question. Found what? Colin said. Kevin's quarter. No, Montoya said. He felt no relief. But you will, he said. Her hand shook a little, holding the rail. Kevin asked me to, she said, the day of the drop. She was the one who suggested the quarter looked like a bone spur, so the record would survive even if she didn't. Mr. Dunworth is worried over nothing, she said, but if something should go wrong, I'll try to be buried in the churchyard, so you have. Voice faltered, so you won't have to dig up half of England. Dunworthy closed his eyes. But you don't know that she's dead if you haven't found the quarter. Colin burst out. You said you didn't even know where she was. How can you be sure she's dead? We've been conducting experiments with laboratory rats. At the dig, only a quarter of an hour's exposure to the virus is required for infection. Kevin was directly exposed to the tomb for over 3 hours. There's a 75% chance she contracted the virus, and with the limited med support available in the 14th century, she's almost certain to have developed complications. Limited med support. It was a century that had dosed people with leeches and strychnine, that had never heard of sterilization or germs or T-cells. They would have stuck filthy poultices on her, muddled prayers, and opened her veins, and the doctors bled them. Gilchrist's book had said, but many died in spite. Without antimicrobials and T-cell enhancement, Montoya said, the virus's mortality rate is 49% probability. Probability, Dunworthy said bitterly. At least Gilchrist figures. Montoya glanced at Colin and frowned. There's a 75% chance Kieran contracted the virus, and a 68% chance she was exposed to the plague. Morbidity for bubonic plague is 91%, and the mortality rate is. She didn't get the plague. Dunworthy said she'd had her plague immunization. Didn't Dr. Ahrens or Gilchrist tell you that? Montoya glanced at Colin again. They said I wasn't allowed to tell him. Colin said, looking defiantly at her, "Tell me what. Is Gilchrist ill?" He remembered looking at the screens, and then collapsing forward into Gilchrist's arms. He wondered if he had infected him when he fell. Montoya said, "Mr. Gilchrist died of the flu 3 days ago." Dunworthy looked at Colin. "What else did they instruct you to keep from me?" Dunworthy demanded, "Who else died while I was ill?" Montoya put up her thin hand as if to stop Colin, but it was too late. "Great Aunt Mary," Colin said, transcript from the Doomsday Book, "Mazar's Run. Away, Roach and I looked everywhere for her, afraid she'd fallen ill and crawled into some corner. But the steward said he saw her starting into the woods while he was digging Walthoff's grave. She was riding Anna's pony. She will only spread it, or make it as far as some village that already has it. It's all around us now. The bells sound like vespers, only out of rhythm, as if the ringers have gone mad. It's impossible to make out whether it is 9 strokes or 3. Course, his double bells told a single stroke this morning. I wonder if it is the baby or one of the chattering girls. She is still unconscious and her pulse is very weak. Agnes screams and struggles in her delirium. She keeps shrieking for me to come, but she won't let me near her when I tried to talk to her. She kicks and screams as if she were having a tantrum. Eloise is wearing herself out trying to tend Agnes, and Lady Armani, who screams. Devil at me when I tend her, and nearly gave me a black eye this morning. The only one who lets me near him is the clerk, who is beyond caring. He cannot possibly last the day. He smells so bad. We've had to move him to the far end of the room. His bubone has started to suppurate again. Break, Gunny, second son of the steward. The woman with the scrofular scars on her neck, Maisry's father. Roche's altar boy Cobb. Break, Lady Amani is very bad. Roche tried to give her the last rites, but she refused to make her confession. You must make your peace with God ere you die, Roche said, but she turned her face to the wall and said, he is to blame for this. Break, 31 cases. Over 75%. Roche consecrated part of the green this morning. Because the churchyard is nearly full, Masonry hasn't come back. She's probably sleeping in the high seat of some manor. House the inhabitants have fled, and when this is all over, she become the ancestor of some noble old family. Perhaps that's what's wrong with our time, Mr. Dunworthy. It was founded by Mary and the bishop's envoy, and so blow it. And all the people who stayed and tried to help. Like Roche caught the plague and died. Break, Lady Amani is unconscious and Roche is giving her the last rites. I told him too, it is the disease that speaks. Her soul has not turned against God. I said, which isn't true. And perhaps she does not deserve forgiveness. But she does not deserve this either. Her body poisoned, rotting. And I can scarcely condemn her for blaming God when I blame her and neither is responsible. It's a disease. The consecrated wine has run out, and there is no more olive oil. Roche is using cooking oil from the kitchen. It smells rancid. Where he touches her temples and the palms of our hands, the skin turns black. It's a disease. Break, Agnes is worse. It's terrible to watch her lying there, panting like her poor puppy and screaming. Tell Kevin to come and get me. I do not like it here. Even Roche can't stand it. Why does God punish us thus? He asked me. He doesn't. It's a disease, I said, which is no answer, and he knows it. All of Europe knows it, and the church knows it too. It will hang on for a few more centuries making excuses, but it can't overcome the essential fact that he let this happen, that he comes to no one's rescue. Break, the bells have stopped. Roche asked me if I thought it was a sign the plague had stopped. Perhaps God has been able to come to help us after all. He said, I don't think so. In Toulouse, church officials sent out an order stopping the bells because the sound frightened the people. Perhaps the Bishop of Bart has sent one out as well. The sound was frightening, but the silence is worse. It's like the end of the world. Chapter 30. Mary had been dead almost the entire time. He had been ill. She had come down with it the day the analog arrived. She had developed pneumonia almost immediately. And on the second day her heart had stopped. January 6th Epiphany. You should have told me, Dunworthy had said. I did tell you Colin had protested. Don't you remember? He had no memory of it at all. And had no warning even when Mrs. Gadsden was allowed free access to his room. When Colin had said they won't tell you anything, it had not even struck him as odd that she hadn't come to see him. I told you when she got ill. Colin had said, and I told you when she died, but you were too old to care. He thought of Colin waiting outside her room for news, and then coming and standing by his bedside, trying to tell him, I'm sorry, Colin, you couldn't help it that you were ill. Colin said, it wasn't your fault. Dunworthy had told Miss Taylor that, and she had not believed him. Any more than he believed Colin now. He didn't think that Colin believed it either. It was all right, Colin said. Everyone was very nice except Sister. She wouldn't let me tell you, even after you started getting better. But everyone else was nice except the Goldstone. She kept reading me scriptures about how God strikes down the unrighteous. Mr. Finch rang my mother, but she couldn't come. And so he made all the funeral arrangements. He was very nice. The Americans were nice too. They kept giving me sweets. I'm sorry, Dunworthy had said then and after. Colin had gone expelled by the ancient sister. I'm sorry, Colin had not been back, and Dunworthy didn't know whether the nurse had barred him from the infirmary or whether, in spite of what he said, Colin would not forgive him. He had abandoned Colin, gone off, and left him at the mercy of Mrs. Godson and the sister and doctors, who would not tell him anything. He had gone where he could not be reached, as incommunicado as Basingham, salmon fishing on some river in Scotland, and no matter what Colin said, he believed that if Dunworthy had truly wanted to, illness or no, he could have been there to help him. You think Kevin's dead too, don't you? Colin had asked him after Montoya left, like Miss Montoya does. I'm afraid so. But you said she couldn't get the plague. What if she's not dead? What if she's at the rendezvous right now, waiting for you? She'd been infected with influenza, Colin. But so were you, and you didn't die. Maybe she didn't die either. I think you should go see Battery and see if he has any ideas. Maybe he could turn the machine on again or something. You don't understand. He'd said it's not like a pocket torch. The fix can't be switched on again. Well, maybe he could do another one. A new fix to the same time a drop. Even with the coordinates already known, took days to set up. And Battery didn't have the coordinates. He only had the date. He could make a new set of coordinates based on the date. If the location else had stayed the same, if Battery and his fever hadn't scrambled them as well, and if the paradoxes would allow a second drop at all. There was no way to explain it to Colin, no way. To tell him Kivrin could not possibly have survived influenza in a century, where the standard treatment was bloodletting. It won't work, Colin, he had said suddenly. Too tired to explain anything. I'm sorry. So you're just going to leave her there, whether she's dead or not? You're not even going to ask Petrie? Colin, Aunt Mary did everything for you. She didn't give up. What is going on in here? The sister had demanded. Creaking in, I'm going to have to ask you to leave if you persist in upsetting the patient. I was leaving anyway, Colin had said, and flung himself out. He hadn't come back that afternoon or all evening or the next morning. Am I being allowed visitors? Dunworthy asked William's nurse when she came on duty. Yes, she said, looking at the screens. There's someone waiting to see you now. It was Mrs. Gadsden. She already had her Bible open. Luke chapter 23 verse 33, she said. glaring pestilently at him, "Since you're so interested in the crucifixion, and when they will come to the place, which is called Calvary, there they crucified him." If God had known where his son was, he would never have let them do that to him. Dunworthy thought he would have pulled him out. He would have come and rescued him. During the Black Death, the Contempts believed God had abandoned them. "Why do you turn your face from us?" They had written, "Why do you ignore our cries?" But perhaps he hadn't heard them. Perhaps he had been unconscious, lying ill in heaven, helpless himself and unable to come, and there was a darkness over all the earth. Until the 9th hour, Mrs. Gadsden read, "And the sun was darkened." The Contempts had believed it was the end of the world, that Armageddon had come, that Satan had triumphed at last. He had, Dunworthy thought. He had closed the net. He had lost the fix. He thought about Gilchrist. He wondered if he had realized what he had done before he died, or if he had lain unconscious and oblivious, unaware that he had murdered Kevin, and Jesus led them out as far as to Bethany. Mrs. Gadsden read, "And he lifted up his hands and blessed them. And it came to pass while he blessed them, he was parted from them and carried up into heaven." He was parted from them and was carried up into heaven. God did come to get him, Dunworthy thought, but too late, too late. She went on reading until William's nurse came on duty. "Nap time," she said briskly. Shooing Mrs. Gadsden out, she came over to the bed, snatched his pillow from under his head, and gave it several sharp whacks. "Has Colin come?" he asked. "I haven't seen him since yesterday," she said, pushing the pillow back under his head. "I want you to try to go to sleep now. Miss Montoya hasn't been here, not since yesterday." She handed him a capsule and a paper cup. "Have there been any messages?" "No messages," she said. She took the empty cup from him. "Try to sleep. No messages." "I'll try to be buried in the churchyard," Kevin had told Montoya, but they'd run out of room in the churchyards. They had buried the plague victims in trenches, in ditches. They had thrown them in the river toward the end. They hadn't buried them at all. They had piled them in heaps and set fire to them. Montoya would never find the code, and if she did, what would the message be? "I went to the drop, but it didn't open." What happened? Kevin's voice rising in panic and reproach, crying, "Eloi, Eloi, why hast thou forsaken me?" William's nurse, maid, him sit up in a chair to eat his lunch while he was finishing his stewed prunes. Finch came in. "We're nearly out of tinned fruit," he said, pointing at Dunworthy's tray and lavatory paper. "I have no idea how they expect us to start term." He sat down on the edge of the bed. "The university has set the start of term for the 25th, but we simply can't be ready by then. We still have 15 patients in Salvin. The mass immunizations have scarcely started. And I'm not at all convinced we've seen the last of the flu cases." "What about Colin?" Dunworthy said. "Is he all right?" "Yes, sir. He was a bit melancholy after Dr. Aarons passed away, but he's cheered up a good deal since you've been on the mend." "I wanted to thank you for helping him," Dunworthy said. "Colin told me you'd arranged for the funeral." "Oh, I was glad to help, sir. He'd no one else. You know, I was certain his mother would come, now that the danger's passed. But she said it was too difficult to make arrangements on such short notice. She did send lovely flowers, lilac and laser blossoms. We held the service in Balio's chapel." He shifted on the bed. "Oh, and speaking of the chapel, I do hope you don't mind, but I've given permission to Holy Reform to use it for a handbell concert on the 15th. The American bell ringers are going to perform Rambo's When at Last My Savior Cometh, and Holy Reform's been requisitioned by the NHS as an immunization center. I do hope that's all right." "Yes," Dunworthy said, thinking about Mary. He wondered when they had had the funeral, and if they had rung the bell afterward. "I can tell them you'd rather they used St. Mary's." Finch said anxiously, "No, of course not." Dunworthy said, "Chapel's perfectly all right. You've obviously been doing a fine job in my absence." "Well, I try, sir. It's difficult with Mrs. Gadsden." He stood up. "I don't want to keep you from your rest. If there's anything I can bring you, anything I can do," No Danworthy said, "There's nothing you can do." He started for the door and then stopped. "I hope you'll accept my condolences, Mr. Dunworthy," he said, looking uncomfortable. "I know how close you and Dr. Orens were." Close, he thought after Finch was gone. "I wasn't close at all." He tried to remember Mary leaning over him, giving him his temp, looking up anxiously at the screens. To remember Colin, standing by his bed in his new jacket and his muffler, saying, "Great Aunt Mary's dead. Dead, can't you hear me?" But there was no memory there at all, nothing. The sister came in and hooked up another drip. That put him out, and when he woke, he felt abruptly better. "It's your T-cell enhancement taking hold," William's nurse told him. "We've been seeing it in a good number of cases. Some of them make miraculous recoveries." She made him walk to the toilet, and after lunch, "Down the corridor, the farther you can go, the better," she said, kneeling to put his slippers on. "I'm not going anywhere," he thought. Gilchrist shut down the net. She strapped his drip bag to his shoulder, hooked a portable motor to it, and helped him on with his robe. "You mustn't worry about the depression," she said, helping him out of bed. "It's a common symptom after influenza. It will fade as soon as your chemical balance is restored." She walked him out into the corridor. "You might want to visit some of your friends," she said. "There are the patients from Balliol in the ward at the end of the corridor. Miss Pontini's the fourth bed." She could do with a bit of cheering. "Did Mr. Latimer?" he said, and stopped. "Is Mr. Latimer still a patient?" "Yes," she said, and he could tell from her voice that Latimer hadn't recovered from his stroke. "He's 2 doors down." He shuffled down the corridor to Latimer's room. He hadn't gone to see Latima after he fell ill. First because of having to wait for Andrew's call, and then because the infirmary had run out of SPGs. Mary had said he had suffered complete paralysis and loss of function. He pushed open the door to Latimer's room. Latimer lay with his arms at his sides, the left one crooked slightly to accommodate the hook UPS and the drip. There were tubes in his nose and down his throat, and op fibers leading from his head and chest to the screens above the bed. His face was half obscured by them, but he gave no sign that they bothered him. "Latimer," he said, going to stand beside the bed. There was no indication he'd heard. His eyes were open, but they didn't shift at the sound, and his face under the tangle of tubes didn't change. He looked vague, distant, as if he were trying to remember a line from Chaucer. "Mr. Latimer," he said more loudly, and looked up at the screens. They didn't change either. "He's not aware of anything," Dunworthy thought. He put his hand on the back of the chair. "You don't know anything that's happened, do you?" he said. "Mary's dead. Kevin's in 1348, he said, watching the screens, "and you don't even know." Gilchrist shut down the net. The screens didn't change. The lines continued to move steadily, unconcernedly across the displays. Ewan Gilchrist sent her into the Black Death. He shouted, "And you lie there." He stopped and sank down in the chair. "I tried to tell you Great Aunt Mary was dead," Colin had said, "but you were too ill." Colin had tried to tell him, but he had lain there like Latimer, unconcerned, oblivious. "Colin will never forgive me," he thought, "anymore. Then he'll forgive his mother for not coming to the funeral." What did Finch said that? It was too difficult to make arrangements on such short notice. He thought of Colin alone at the funeral, looking at the lilacs and laser blossoms his mother had sent, at the mercy of Mrs. Gadsden and the bell ringers. "My mother couldn't come," Colin had said, but he didn't believe it, of course. She could have come if she had truly wanted to. "He will never forgive me," he thought, "and neither will Kevin. She's older than Colin." She imagined all sorts of extenuating circumstances, perhaps even the true one, but in her heart left to the mercy of who knows what. Cutthroats and thieves and pestilences. She will not believe I could not have come to her if I had truly wanted to. Dunworthy stood up with difficulty, holding on to the seat in the back of the chair, and not looking at Latimer or the displays, and went back out into the corridor. There was an empty stretcher trolley against the wall, and he leaned against it for a moment. Mrs. Gadsden came out of the ward. "There you are, Mr. Dunworthy. She said I was just coming to read to you." She opened her Bible. "Should you be up?" "Yes," he said. "Well, I must say I'm glad you're recovering at last. Things have simply fallen apart while you've been ill." "Yes," he said. "You really must do something about Mr. Finch, you know. He allows the Americans to practice their bells at all hours of the day and night, and when I complained to him about it, he was quite rude, and he has signed my Willie, nursing duties, nursing duties. When Willie's always been susceptible to illness, it's been a miracle that he didn't come down with the virus before this. It very definitely has been thought downworthy, considering the number of very probable infectious young women he had had contact with during the epidemic. He wondered what odds probability would give on his having remained unscathed, and then for Mr. Finch to assign him nursing duties. Mrs. Gadsden was saying, "I didn't allow it, of course. I refused to let you endanger Willie's health in this irresponsible manner," I told him. "I cannot stand idly by when my child is in mortal danger." I said, "Mortal danger? I must go see Miss Pontini." "Dunworthy said you should go back to bed. You look quite dreadful." She shook the Bible at him. "Scandalous the way they run this infirmary, allowing their patients to go gadding about. You'll have a relapse and die, and you'll have no one but yourself to blame." "No," Dunworthy said, pushed open the door into the ward and went inside. He had expected the ward to be nearly empty, the patients all sent home, but every bed was full. Most of the patients were sitting up, reading or watching portable videos, and one was sitting in a wheelchair beside his bed, looking out at the rain. It took Dunworthy a moment to recognize him. Colin had said he'd had a relapse, but he had not expected this. He looked like an old man, his dark face pinched to whiteness under the eyes, and in long lines down the sides of the mouth. His hair had gone completely white. "Bettery," he said. Bettery turned around. "Mr. Dunworthy, I didn't know that you were in this ward." Dunworthy said, "They moved me here after." He stopped. "I heard that you were better." "Yes, I can't bear this," Dunworthy thought. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you, and you much improved." "Of course there is the depression, but that is a normal post-viral symptom." Badri wheeled his chair round to face the window, and Dunworthy wondered if he could not bear it either. "I made an error in the coordinates when I refed them," Badri said, looking out at the rain. "I fed in the wrong data. He should say you were ill. You had a fever." He should tell him mental confusion was an early symptom. He should say it was not your fault. "I didn't realize I was ill," Badri said, picking at his robe, as he had plucked at the sheet in his delirium. "I'd had a headache all morning, but I put it down to working the net. I should have realized something was wrong, and aborted the drop, and I should have refused to tutor her. I should have insisted Gilchrist run perimeter checks. I should have made him open the net as soon as you said there was something wrong. I should have opened the net the day you fell ill, and not waited for the rendezvous," Battery said, twisting the sash between his fingers. "I should have opened it immediately." Dunworthy glanced automatically at the wall above Badri's head, but there were no screens above the bed. Badri was not even wearing a temp patch. You wondered if it was possible that Barry didn't know Gilchrist had shut down the net, if in their concern for his recovery, they had kept it from Barry. As they had kept the news of Mary's death from him, they refused to discharge me from hospital. Batri said I should have forced them to let me go. I will have to tell him, Dunworthy thought, but he didn't. He stood there silently, watching Bardwell torture the sash into wrinkles. and feeling infinitely sorry for him. Miss Montreuil showed me the probability statistics. Bidou said, "Do you think Kevin's dead?" "I hope so," he thought. "I hope she died of the virus." Before she realized where she was. Before she realized we had left her there. "It was not your fault," he said. "I was only 2 days late opening the net. I was certain she'd be there, waiting. I was only 2 days late." "What?" Dunworthy said. "I tried to get permission to leave hospital on the 6th, but they refused to discharge me until the 8th. I got the net open as soon as I could, but she wasn't there." "What are you talking about?" Dunworthy said. "How could you open the net?" "Gilchrist shut it down." Betty looked up at him. "We used the backup." "What backup?" "The fix I did on our net." Patrice said, sounding bewildered. "You were so worried about the way Medieval was running. The drop, I decided I better put on a backup, in case something went wrong. I came to Balliol to ask you about it Tuesday afternoon. But you weren't there. I left you a note saying I needed to talk to you." "A note?" Dunworthy said. "The laboratory was open. I ran a redundant fix through Bellil's net." Badri said, "You were so worried." The strength seemed suddenly to go out of Dunworthy's legs. He sat down on the bed. "I tried to tell you," Badri said, "but I was too ill to make myself." Understood. There had been a backup all along. He had wasted days and days trying to force Gilchrist to unlock the laboratories, searching for Basingham, waiting for Polly Wilson to contrive a way into the university's computer. And all the while the fix had been in the net at Balliol. So worried Battery had said through his delirium, "Is the laboratory open back up?" He had said, "Back up. Can you open the net again?" "Of course. But even if she hasn't contracted the plague," "She hasn't." Dunworthy cut in. "She was immunized. She wouldn't still be there. It's been 8 days since the rendezvous. She couldn't have waited there all this time. Can someone else go through?" "Someone else," Baudry said blankly, "to look for her. Could someone else use the same drop to go through?" "I don't know. How long would it take you to set it up?" "So we could try it. 2 hours at the most. The temporals and locals are already set. But I don't know how much slippage there be." The door to the ward burst open and Colin came in. "There you are," he said. "The nurse said you'd taken a walk, but I couldn't find you anywhere. I thought you got lost." "Number," Dunworthy said, looking at Badri. "She said I'm to bring you back," Colin said, taking hold of Dunworthy's arm and helping him up. "That you're not to overdo." He herded him toward the door. Dunworthy stopped at the door. "Which net did you use when you opened the net?" "On the 8th, he said to Badri. "Balliol's." He said, "I was afraid part of the permanent memory had been erased when Bray's noses was shut down, and there was no time to run a damage assessment. Routine." Colin backed the door open. "The sister comes on duty in half an hour. You don't want her to find you up." He let the door swing shut. "I'm sorry I wasn't back sooner, but I had to take immunization schedules." Out to Godstow, Dunworthy leaned against the door. There might be too much slippage, and the tech was in a wheelchair, and he was not sure he could walk as far as the end of the corridor, let alone back to his room. So worried. He had thought but dreamt you were so worried. I decided to refeed the coordinates, but he had meant I put on a backup. "A backup? Are you all right?" Colin asked. "You're not having a relapse or anything, are you?" "No," he said. "Did you ask Mr. Chowdhury if he could redo the fix?" "No," he said. "There was a backup, a backup." He said excitedly, "You mean another fix?" "Yes. Does that mean you can rescue her?" He stopped and leaned against the stretcher trolley. "I don't know. I'll help you," Colin said. "What do you want me to do?" "I'll do anything you say. I can run errands and fetch things for you." "You won't have to do a thing. It might not work," Dunworthy said. "The slippage, but you're going to try, aren't you?" A band tightened round his chest with every step, and Padre had already had one relapse. And even if they managed it, the net might not send him through. "Yes," he said, "I'm going to try." Apocalyptic. Colin said, transcript from the Doomsday Book. Lady Amani, mother of Guillaume de Vergeau. Break. Rosamond is sinking. I can't feel the pulse in her wrist at all, and her skin looks yellow and waxen. Which I know is a bad sign. Agnes is fighting hard. She still doesn't have any buboes or vomiting. Which is a good sign. I think Eloise had to cut off her hair. She kept pulling at it, screaming for me to come and braid it. Break. Roach has anointed Rosamond. She couldn't make a confession. Of course, Agnes seems better, though she had a nosebleed a little while ago. She asked for her bell. Break. You bastard, I will not let you take her. She's only a child, but that's your specialty, isn't it, slaughtering the innocents? You've already killed a Stewart's baby and Inez's puppy, and the boy who went for help when I was in the hut. And that's enough. I won't let you kill her too. You son of a bitch, I won't let you. Chapter 31. Agnes died the day after New Year's, still screaming for Kevin to come. She's here, Eloise said, squeezing her hand. Lady Catherine is here. She is not. Agnes wailed, her voice hoarse, but still strong. Tell her to come. I will, Eloise promised, and then looked up at Kevin, her expression faintly puzzled. Go and fetch Father Roach, she said. What is it? Kevin asked. He had administered the last rites that first night. Agnes flailing and kicking at him, as if she were having a tantrum, and since then she had refused to let him near her. Are you a lady? Eloise shook her head, still looking at Kevin. What will I tell my husband when he comes? She said, and laid Inez's hand along her side. And it was only then that Kevin realized she was dead. Kevin washed her little body, which was nearly covered with purplish blue bruises. Where Eloise had held her hand, the skin was completely black. She looked like she'd been beaten, as she had been, Kevin thought. Beaten and tortured and murdered, the slayer of the innocents. Inez's surcoat and shift were ruined. A stiffened mass of blood and vomit, and her everyday linen. Shift had long since been torn into strips. Kivrin wrapped her body in her own white cloak, and Roach and the steward buried her. Eloise did not come. I must stay with Rosamond, she said when Kevin told her it was time. There was nothing Eloise could do for Rosamond. The girl still lay, as still as if she were under a spell. And Kevin thought, the fever must have caused some brain damage, and Garwin may come. Eloise said, it was very cold. Roach and the steward puffed out great clouds of condensation as they lowered Agnes into the grave. And the sight of their white breath infuriated Kivrin. She doesn't weigh anything, she thought bitterly. You could carry her in one hand. The sight of all the graves angered her too. The churchyard was filled, and nearly all the rest of the green that Roach had consecrated. Lady Amina's grave was almost in the path to the Lich Gate, and the steward's baby did not have one father. Roach had let it be buried at his mother's feet, though it had not been baptized, and the churchyard was still full. What about the steward's youngest son? Kevin thought angrily, and the clerk. Where do you plan to put them? The Black Death was only supposed to have killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe, not all of it. Requiescat in parce, amen, Roach said, and the steward began shoveling the frozen dirt onto the little bundle. You were right, Mr. Danworthy, she thought bitterly. White only gets dirty. You're right about everything, aren't you? You told me not to come. The terrible things would happen. Well, they have, and you can't wait to tell me I told you so. But you won't have that satisfaction, because I don't know where the drop is. And the only person who does is probably dead. She didn't wait for the steward to finish shoveling dirt down on Agnes, or for Father Roach to complete his chummy little chat with God. She started across the green, furious with all of them, with the steward for standing there with his spade, eager to dig more graves, with Eloise for not coming, with Garwin for not coming. No one's coming, she thought, no one. Catherine Roach called. She turned, and he half ran up to her, his breath like a cloud around him. What is it? She demanded. He looked at her solemnly. We must not give up hope, he said. Why not? She burst out. We're up to 85%, and we haven't even got started. The clerk is dying, Rosamond's dying. You've all been exposed, why shouldn't I give up hope? God has not abandoned us utterly, he said. Agnes is safe in his arms. Safe, she thought bitterly, in the ground, in the cold. In the dark, she put her hands up to her face. She's in heaven where the plague cannot reach her. And God's love is ever with us, he said, and naught can separate us from it. Neither death nor life nor angels, nor things present, nor things to come, Kevin said, nor height nor depth nor any other creature, he said. He put his hand on her shoulder gently, as if you were anointing her. It was his love that sent you to help us. She put her hand up to his, where it rested on her shoulder, and held it tightly. We must help each other, she said. They stood there like that for a long minute. And then Roach said, I must go and ring the bell, that Agnes's soul may have safe passage. She nodded and took her hand away. I'll go check on Rosamond and the others, she said, and went into the courtyard. Eloise had said she needed to stay with Rosamond. But when Kivrin got back to the manor house, she was nowhere near her. She lay curled up on Agnes's pallet, wrapped in her cloak, watching the door. Perhaps his horse was stolen by those who would flee the pestilence, she said. And that is why he is so long in coming. Agnes is buried, Kevin said coldly, and went to check on Rosamond. She was awake. She looked up solemnly at Kevin when she knelt by her and reached for Kevin's hand. Oh, Rosamond, Kevin said, tears stinging her nose and eyes. Sweetheart, how do you feel? Hungry, Rosamond said. Has my father come? Not yet, Kevin said. And it even seemed possible that he might. I will fetch you some broth. You must rest until I come back. You have been very ill. Rosamond obediently closed her eyes. They looked less sunken, though they still had dark bruises under them. Where's Agnes, she asked. Catherine smoothed her dark, tangled hair back from her face. She is sleeping. Good, Rosamond said. I would not have her shouting and playing. She is too noisy. I will fetch you the broth, Kevin said. She went over to Eloise. Lady Eloise, I have good news, she said eagerly. Rosamond is awake. Eloise raised herself up on one elbow and looked at Rosamond, but apathetically, as if she was thinking of something else. And presently she lay down again. Kevin, alarmed, put her hand to Eloise's forehead. It seemed warm, but Kevin's hands were still cold from outside, and she couldn't tell for certain. Are you ill, she asked. No, Eloise said, but still as if her mind were on something else. What shall I tell him? You can tell him that Rosamond is better, she said, and this time it seemed to get through to her. Eloise got up and went over to Rosamond and sat down beside her, but by the time Kevin came back from the kitchen with a broth, she had gone back to Agnes's pallet and lay curled up under her fur-trimmed cloak. Rosamond was asleep, but it was not the frightening, death-like sleep of before. Her color was better, though. Her skin was still drawn tightly over her cheekbones. Eloise was asleep too, or feigning sleep, and it was just as well. While she had been in the kitchen, the clerk had crawled off his pallet and halfway over the barricade, and when Kevin tried to haul him back, he struck out at her wildly. She had to go fetch Father Roach to help subdue him. His right eye had ulcerated, the plague eating its way out from inside, and the clerk clawed at it viciously with his hands. Damne Jesus Christ, he swore, Fidelium defunctorium de penis infamus. Save the souls of the faithful, departed from the pains of hell. Yes, Kevin prayed, wrestling with his clawed hands. Save him now. She rummaged through a miner's medical kit again, searching for something to kill the pain. There was no opium powder, and was the opium poppy even in England? Yet in 1348, she found a few papery, orange scraps that looked a little like poppy petals, and steeped them in hot water, but the clerk couldn't drink it. His mouth was a horror of open sores, his teeth and tongue caked with dried blood. He doesn't deserve this, Kevin thought. Even if he did bring the plague here, nobody deserves this. Please, she prayed. and wasn't sure what she asked. Whatever it was not granted. The clerk began to vomit, a dark bile streaked with blood. And it snowed for 2 days, and Eloise grew steadily worse. It did not seem to be the plague. She had no buboes, and she didn't cough or vomit, and Kevin wondered if it were illness or simply grief or guilt. "What shall I tell him?" Eloise said over and over again. "He sent us here to keep us safe." Kevin felt her forehead. It was warm. "They're all going to get it," she thought. "Lord Guillaume sent them here to keep them safe. But they're all going to get it one by one. I have to do something." But she couldn't think of anything. The only protection from the plague was flight. But they had already fled here, and it had not protected them. And they couldn't flee with Rosamond and Eloise ill. But Rosamond's getting stronger every day, Kevin thought, and Eloise doesn't have the plague. It's only a fever. Perhaps they have another estate where we could go. In the north, the plague was not in Yorkshire yet. She could see to it that they kept away from the other people on the roads, that they weren't exposed. She asked Rosamond if they had a manor in Yorkshire. "Nay," Rosamond said, sitting up against one of the benches. "In Dorset, but that was of no use. The plague was already there." And Rosamond, though she was better, was still too weak to sit up for more than a few minutes. She could never ride a horse. If we had horses, Kevin thought. "My father had a living in Surrey also," Rosamond said. "We stayed there when Agnes was born." She looked at Kevin. "Did Agnes die?" "Yes," Gervin said. She nodded as if she were not surprised. "I heard her screaming." Kevin couldn't think of anything to say to that. "My father is dead, isn't he?" There was nothing to say to that either. He was almost certainly dead, and Garwin too. It had been 8 days since he had left for Bath. Eloise, still feverish, had said this morning, "He will come now that the storm is over." But even she had not seemed to believe it. "He may yet come," Kevin said. "The snow may have delayed him." The steward came in carrying his spade, and stopped at the barricade in front of them. He had been coming in every day to look at his son, staring at him dumbly over the upturned table. But now he only glanced at him, and then turned to stare at Kivrin and Rosamond, leaning on his spade. His cap and shoulders were covered with snow, and the blade of the spade was wet with it. "He has been digging another grave." Kevin thought. "Whose? Has someone died?" she asked. "No," he said, and went on looking almost speculatively at Rosamond. Kevin stood up. "Did you want something?" He looked at her blankly, as if he could not comprehend the question, and then back at Rosamond. "No," he said, and picked up the spade and went out. "Goes he to dig on Nes's grave?" Rosamond asked, looking after him. "No," Kevin said gently. "She is already buried in the churchyard." "Goes he then to dig mine?" "No," Kevin said, appalled. "No, you're not going to die. You're getting better. You were very ill, but the worst is over. Now you must rest and try to sleep, so you can get well." Rosamond lay down obediently and closed her eyes. But after a moment she opened them again. "My father being dead, the crown will dispose of my dowry," she said. "Think you Sir Bloet still lives?" "I hope not," Kevin thought. And then, poor child. Has she been worrying about her marriage all this time? Poor little thing. His being dead is the only good to come out of the plague. If he is dead, you mustn't worry about him now. You must rest and get your strength back. The king will sometimes honor a previous betrothal. Rosamond said, her thin hands plucking at the blanket. "If both parties be agreed, you don't have to agree to anything." Kevin thought, he's dead, the bishop killed them. "If they are not agreed, the king will bid me marry who he will." Rosamond said, "And Sablot at least is known to me." No, Kevin thought, and knew it was probably the best thing. Rosamond had been conjuring worse horrors than Sablot. Monsters and cutthroats, and Kevin knew they existed. Rosamond would be sold off to some nobleman the king owed a debt to, or whose allegiance he was trying to buy. One of the troublesome supporters of the Black Prince, perhaps, and taken God knew where, to God knew what situation. There were worse things than a leering old man and a shrewish sister-in-law. Baron Garnet had kept his wife in chains for 20 years. The Count of Anjou had burned his alive, and Rosamond would have no family, no friends to protect her, to tend her when she was ill. I'll take her away, Kevin thought suddenly, to somewhere where blow it can't find her, and will be safe from the plague. There was no such place. It was already in Bath and Oxford, and moving south and east to London, and then Kent north through the Midlands to Yorkshire, and back across the Channel to Germany and the Low Countries. It had even gone to Norway, floating in on a ship of dead men. There was nowhere that was safe. Is Garwin here? Rosamond asked, and she sounded like her mother, her grandmother. I would have him ride to Courcy and tell Sabert that I would come to him. Gwyn, Eloise said from her pallet. Is he coming? No, Kivrin thought. No one's coming, not even Mr. Dunworthy. It didn't matter that she had missed the rendezvous. There would have been no one there, because they didn't know she was in 1348. If they knew, they would never have left her here. Something must have gone wrong with the net. Mr. Dunworthy had been worried about sending her so far back without parameter checks. There could be unforeseen complications. At that distance, he'd said. Perhaps an unforeseen complication had garbled the fix or made them lose it. And they were looking for her in 1320. I've missed the rendezvous by nearly 30 years. She thought. Go in, Eloise said again, and tried to rise from her pallet. She couldn't. She was growing steadily worse. Though she still had none of the marks of the plague, when it began to snow she had said, relieved, he will not come now until the storm is over, and gotten up and gone to sit with Rosamond. But by the afternoon she had to lie down again, and her fever went steadily higher. Roach heard her confession. Looking worn out. They were all worn out. If they sat down to rest, they were asleep in seconds. The steward coming in to look at his son, Lafrique had stood at the barricade snoring, and Kevin had dozed off while tending the fire and burned a hand badly. We can't go. Unlike this, she thought, watching Father Roach making the sign of the cross over Eloise. He'll die of exhaustion. He'll come down with the plague. I have to get them away, she thought again. The plague didn't reach everywhere. There were villages that were completely untouched. It had skipped over Poland and Bohemia, and there were parts of northern Scotland. It had never reached Universitas Gatolis, Peccato Mund. Miserere nobis, Father Roach said. His voice is comforting, as it had been when she was dying, and she knew it was hopeless. He would never leave his parishioners. The history of the Black Death was full of stories of priests who had abandoned their people, who had refused to perform burials, who had locked themselves in their churches and monasteries or run away. She wondered now if those statistics were inaccurate, too, and even if she found some way to take them all. Eloise, turning even now, as she made her confession, to look at the door, would insist on waiting for Garwin, for her husband to come, as she was convinced they would. Now that the snow had stopped, has Father Roach gone to meet them? She asked Kevin when Roach left, to take the sacraments back to the church. He will be here soon, he has, no doubt, gone first to Courcy to warn them of the plague, and it is only half a day's journey from there. She insisted that Kivrin move her pallet in front of the door, while Kivrin was rearranging the barricade to keep the draft from the door off her. The clerk cried out suddenly and went into convulsions. His whole body spasmed as if he were being shocked, and his face became a terrible rictus, his ulcerated eyes staring upward. Don't do this to him, Kevin shouted, trying to wedge the spoon from Rosamond's broth between his teeth. Hasn't he been through enough? His body jerked. Stop it, Kevin sobbed. Stop it. His body abruptly slackened. She jammed a spoon between his teeth, and a little trickle of black slime came out of the side of his mouth. He's dead, she thought, and could not believe it. She looked at him, his ulcerated eye half open. his face swollen and blackened under the stubble of his beard. His fists were clenched at his side. He did not look human lying there. And Kivrin covered his face with a rough blanket, afraid that Rosamond might see him. "Is he dead?" Rosamond asked, sitting up curiously. "Yes," Kevin said. "Thank God." She stood up. "I must go tell Father Roche." "I would not have you leave me here alone," Rosamond said. "Your mother is here," Kivrin said, "and a steward's son, and I will only be a few minutes." "I am afraid," Rosamond said. "So am I," Kevin thought. Looking down at the coarse blanket, he was dead. But even that had not relieved his suffering. He looked still in anguish, still in terror, though his face no longer looked even human. "The pains of hell, please do not leave me," Rosamond said. "I must tell Father Roche," Kevin said, but she sat down between the clerk and Rosamond and waited until she was asleep. Before she went to find him, he wasn't in the courtyard or the kitchen. The steward's cow was in the passage, eating the hay from the bottom of the pigsty, and it ambled after her out onto the green. The steward was in the churchyard digging a grave, his chest level with the snowy ground. He already knows, she thought. But that was impossible. Her heart began to pound. "Where's Father Roche?" she called, but the steward didn't answer or look up. The cow came up beside her and lowed at her. "Go away," she said, and ran across to the steward. The grave was not in the churchyard. It lay on the green past the lich gate, and there were 2 other graves in a line next to it, the iron-hard dirt piled on the snow beside each one. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Whose graves are those?" The steward flung a spadeful of dirt onto the mound. The frozen clods made a clattering sound like stones. "Why do you dig 3 graves?" She said. "Who has died?" The cow nudged her shoulder with its horn. She twisted away from it. "Who has died?" The steward jabbed a spade into the iron-hard ground. "It is the last days, boy," he said, stepping down hard on the blade. And Kevin felt a jerk of fear, and then realized he hadn't recognized her. In her boy's clothes. "It's me, Catherine," she said. He looked up and nodded. "It is the end of time," he said. "Those who have not died will." He leaned forward, putting his whole weight on the spade. The cow tried to dig his head in under her arm. "Go away," she said, and hit it on the nose. It backed to it, gingerly skirting the graves, and Kieran noticed they were not all the same size. The first was large, but the one next to it was no bigger than Anez's had been, and the one he stood in did not look much longer. "I told Rosamond he wasn't digging her grave," she thought, "but he was." "You have no right to do this," she said. "Your son and Rosamond are getting better, and Lady Alois is only tired and ill with grief. They aren't going to die." The steward looked up at her, his face as expressionless as when he had stood at the barricade, measuring Rosamond for her grave. "Father Roche says you were sent to help us. But how can you avail against the end of the world?" He stood down on the spade again. "You will have need of these graves, all will die." The cow trotted over to the opposite side of the grave, its face on a level with the steward's, and lowed in his face. But he did not seem to notice it. "You must not dig any more graves," she said. "I forbid it." He went on digging as if he had not noticed her either. "They're not going to die," she said. "The Black Death only killed 1/3 to 1/2 of the contempts. We've already had our quota." He went on digging. Eloise died in the night. The steward had to lengthen Rosamond's grave for Eloise, and when they buried her, Kevin saw he had started another for Rosamond. "I must get them away from here," she thought, looking at the steward. He stood with the spade cradled against his shoulder, and as soon as he had filled in Eloise's grave, he started in on Rosamond's grave again. "I must get them away before they catch it." Because they were going to catch it. It lay in wait for them in the Basili, on their clothes, on the bedding, in the very air they breathe. And if by some miracle they didn't catch it, from that, the plague would sweep through all of Oxfordshire in the spring. Messengers and villagers and bishops' envoys They could not stay here, Scotland, she thought, and started for the manor. I could take them to northern Scotland. The plague didn't reach that far. The steward's son could ride the donkey, and they could make a litter for Rosamond. Rosamond was sitting up on her pallet. The steward's son has been crying out for you, she said as soon as Kivrin came in. He had vomited a bloody mucus. His pallet was filthy with it, and when Kivrin cleaned him up, he was too weak to raise his head. Even if Rosamond can ride, he can't. She thought despairingly, we're not going anywhere. In the night she thought of the wagon that had been at the rendezvous. Perhaps the steward could help her repair it, and Rosamond could ride in that. She lit a rushlight from the coals of the fire and crept out to the stable to look at it. Roche's donkey brayed at her when she opened the door, and there was a rustling sound of sudden scattering as she held the smoky light up. The smashed boxes lay piled against the wagon like a barricade, and she knew as soon as she pulled them away that it wouldn't work. It was too big. The donkey could not pull it, and the wooden axle was missing. Carried off by some enterprising contempt to mend a hedge with, or burn for firewood, or to stave off the plague with, Kevin thought. It was pitch black in the courtyard when she came out, and the stars were sharp and bright as they had been Christmas Eve. She thought of Agnes asleep against her shoulder, the bell on her little wrist, and the sound of the bells tolling the devil's knell. Prematurely, Kivrin thought, the devil isn't dead, yet he's loose on the world. She lay awake a long time, trying to think of another plan. Perhaps they could make some sort of litter the donkey could drag if the snow wasn't too deep. Or perhaps they could put both children on the donkey and carry the baggage in packs on their backs. She fell asleep finally, and was awakened again almost immediately. Or so it seemed to her. It was still dark, and Roche was bending over her. The dying fire lit his face from below, so that he looked as he had in the clearing, when she had thought he was a cutthroat and still partly asleep. She reached out and put her hand gently on his cheek. Lady Catherine, he said, and she came awake. It's Rosamond, she thought, and twisted round to look at her. But she was sleeping easily, a thin hand under her cheek. What is it, she said. Are you ill? He shook his head. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. Has someone come, she said. Scrambling to her feet, he shook his head again. It can't be someone else, she thought. There's no one left. She looked at the pile of blankets by the door, where the steward slept, but he wasn't there. Is the steward Dale? The steward's son is dead, he said in an odd, stunned voice, and she saw that Lafric was gone too. I went to the church to St. Matins, Roche said, and his voice faltered. You must come with me, he said, and strode out. Kevin snatched up her ragged blanket and hurried out into the courtyard after him. It could not be later than 6. The sun was only just above the horizon, staining the overcast sky and the snow with pink. Roche was already disappearing through the narrow passage to the green. Kevin flung the blanket over her shoulders and ran after him. The steward's cow was standing in the passage, its head through a break in the fence of the pigsty, pulling at the straw. It raised its head and mooed at Kevin. Shoo, she said, flapping her hands at it, but it only pulled its head out of the wattle fence and started toward her, lowing. I don't have time to milk you, she said, and shoved its hind quarters out of the way and squeezed past. Father Roche was halfway across the green before she caught up with him. What is it? Can't you tell me? She asked. But he didn't stop or even look at her. He turned toward the line of graves on the green, and she thought, feeling suddenly relieved. The stewards tried to bury his son himself. Without a priest, the small grave was filled in. The snowy dirt mounted over it, and he had finished Rosamond's grave and dug another, larger one. The spade was sticking out of it, its handle leaning against the end. Roche didn't go to Lafric's grave. He stopped at the newest one and said, in that same stunned voice, I went to the church to St. Matins, and Kevin looked into the grave the steward had. Apparently tried to bury himself with the shovel, but it had proved unwieldy in the narrow space, and he had propped it against the end of the grave and begun pulling the dirt down with his hands. He held a large clod in his frozen hand. His legs were nearly covered, and it gave him an indecent look, as if he were lying in his bath. We must bury him properly, she said, and reached for the shovel. Roach shook his head. It is holy ground, he said numbly, and she realized that he thought the steward had killed himself. It doesn't matter, she thought, and realized in spite of everything, horror after horror, Roach still believed in God. He had been going to the church to St. Matins when he found the steward, and if they had all died, he would go on saying them and not find anything incongruous in his prayers. It's the disease, Kevin said, though she had no idea whether it was or not. The septic plague. It infects the blood. Roach looked at her uncomprehendingly. He must have fallen ill while he was digging, she said. Septicemic plague poisons the brain. He was not in his right mind. Like Lady Alamory, he said, sounding almost glad. He didn't want to have to bury him outside the pale, Kevin thought, in spite of what he believes. She helped Roach straighten the steward's body a little, though he was already stiff. They did not attempt to move him or wrap him in a shroud. Roach laid a black cloth over his face, and they took turns shoveling the dirt in on him. The frozen earth clattered like stones. Roach did not go to the church for his vestments or the missal. He stood first beside Lafrique's grave, and then the steward's, and said the prayers for the dead. Kevin, standing beside him, her hands folded, thought he wasn't in his right mind. He had buried his wife and 6 children. He had buried almost everyone he knew. And even if he hadn't been feverish, if he had crawled into the grave and waited to freeze to death, the plague had still killed him. He did not deserve a suicide's grave. He doesn't deserve any grave. Kevin thought he was supposed to go to Scotland with us, and was horrified at the sudden shock of delight. She felt, we can go to Scotland now, she thought, looking at the grave he had dug for Rosamond. Rosamond can ride the donkey, and Rosh and I can carry the food and blankets. She opened her eyes and looked at the sky, but now that the sun was up, the clouds looked lighter, as if they might break up by mid-morning. If they left this morning, they could be out of the forest by noon and onto the Oxford-Bath Road. By night they could be on the highway to York. And you stay qui toi peccato Mundi, Roach said, Donna Isis Requiem. We must take oats for the donkey, she thought, and the axe for cutting firewood and blankets. Roach finished the prayers. Dominos vobiscum ad conspirato tu, he said requiescat in pace amen. He started off to ring the bell. There isn't time for that, Kivrin thought, and then took off toward the manor. She could be half-packed by the time Roach had told the death knell, and she could tell him her plan, and he could load the donkey, and they could go. She ran across the courtyard and into the manor. They would have to take coals to start the fire with. They could use a miser's medicine casket. She went into the hall. Rosamond was still asleep. That was good. There was no point in waking her. Until they were ready to leave, she tipped her head past her and got the casket and emptied it out. She laid it next to the fire and started out to the kitchen. I woke and you were not here, Rosamond said. She sat up on her pallet. I was afraid you had gone. We're all going, Kivrin said. We're going to go to Scotland. She went over to her. You must rest for the journey. I will be back in a bit. Where are you going? Rosamond said. Only to the kitchen. Are you hungry? I will bring you some porridge. Now lie down and rest. I do not like to be alone. Rosamond said, can you not stay with me a little? I don't have time for this, Kevin thought. I'm only going to the kitchen, and Father Rosh is here. Can't you hear him? He's ringing the bell. I'll only be a few minutes. All right. She smiled cheerfully at Rosamond, and she nodded reluctantly. I'll be back soon." She nearly ran outside. Roach was still ringing the death. Now slowly, steadily hurry, she thought we don't have much time. She searched the kitchen, setting the food on the table. There was a round of cheese and plenty of munchies left. She stacked them like plates in a wadmal sack, put in the cheese and carried it out to the well. Rosamond was standing in the door of the manor, holding onto the jam. "Can I not sit in the kitchen with you?" she asked. She had put on her kerchief and her shoes, but she was already shivering in the cold air. "It's too cold," Kevin said, hurrying over to her. "And you must rest. When you are gone, I fear you will not come back." She said. "I'm right here," Kivrin said, but she went inside and fetched Rosamond's cloak and an armload of furs. "You can sit here on the doorstep," she said, "and watch me pack." She put the cloak over Rosamond's shoulders and sat her down, piling the furs about her like a nest. All right, the brooch that Sir Blowhard had given Rosamond was still at the neck of the cloak. She fumbled with the fastening, her thin hands trembling a little. "Do we go to Courcy?" she asked. "No," Kevin said, and pinned the brooch for her. "Oh, suis-en Louis d'Amour. You are here in place of a friend I love. We're going to Scotland. We will be safe from the plague there." "Think you my father died from the plague?" Kevin hesitated. "My mother said he was only delayed or unable to come. She said perhaps my brothers were ill, and he would come when they were recovered, and so he may," Kevin said, tucking a fur around Rosamond's feet. "We'll leave a letter for him, so he'll know where we went." Rosamond shook her head. "If he left, he would have come for me." Kevin wrapped a caftan around Rosamond's thin shoulders. "I must fetch food for us to take," Kevin said gently. Rosamond nodded and Kevin went across to the kitchen. There was a sack of onions against the wall and another of apples. They were wizened and most of them had brown spots, but Kivrin lugged the sack outside. They would not need to be cooked, and they would all be in need of vitamins before spring. "Would you like an apple?" she asked Rosamond. "Yes," Rosamond said, and Kevin searched through the sack, trying to find one that was still firm and unwrinkled. She unearthed the reddish-green one, polished it on her leather hose and took it to her, smiling at the memory of how good an apple would have tasted when she was ill. But after the first bite, Rosamond seemed to lose interest. She leaned back against the door jamb and looked quietly up at the sky, listening to the steady toll of Roche's bell. Kevin went back to sorting the apples, picking out the ones worth taking, and wondering how much the donkey could carry. They would need to take oats for the donkey. There would be no grass, though, when they reached Scotland. There might be heather that it could eat. They shouldn't have to take water. There were plenty of streams. But they would need to take a pot to boil it in. "Your people never came for you," Rosamond said. Kevin looked up. She was still sitting against the door with the apple. "They did come," Kivrin thought, "but I wasn't there." "No," Kivrin said. "Think you the plague has killed them?" "No," Kevin said, and thought, "At least I don't have to think of them dead or helpless somewhere. At least I know they're all right. When I go to Saberlot, I will tell him how you helped us," Rosamond said. "I will ask that I might keep you and Father Roche by me." Her head went up proudly. "I am allowed my own attendants and chaplain." "Thank you," Kevin said solemnly. She set the sack of good apples next to the one of cheese and bread. The bell stopped, its overtones still echoing in the cold air. She picked up the bucket and lowered it into the well. She would cook some porridge and chop the bruised apples into it. It would make a filling meal for the trip. Rosamond's apple rolled past her feet to the base of the well and stopped. Kevin stooped to pick it up. It had only a little bite out of it, white against the shriveled red. Kivrin wiped it against her jerkin. "You dropped your apple," she said, and turned to give it back to her. Her hand was still open, as if she had leaned forward to catch it when it fell. "Oh, Rosamond," Kevin said. Transcript from the Doomsday Book, Father Roach and I are going to Scotland. There really isn't any point in telling you that, I suppose, since you'll never hear what's on this quarter. But perhaps someone will stumble across it on a morsome day, or Miss Montoya will do a dig in northern Scotland when she's finished with Sken Gate, and if that happens, I wanted you to know what happened to us. I know flight is probably the worst thing to do, but I have to get farther, Roach, away from here. The whole manor is contaminated with the plague bedding, clothes the air, and the rats are everywhere. I saw one in the church when I went to get Roche's Albin stole for Rosamond's funeral, and even if he doesn't catch it from them, the plague is all around us, and I will never be able to convince him to stay here. He will want to go and help. We'll keep off the roads and away from the villages. We've got food enough for a week, and then we'll be far enough north that I should be able to buy food in a town. The clerk had a sack of silver with him. And don't worry, we'll be all right. As Mr. Gilchrist would say, I've taken every possible precaution. Chapter 32. Apocalyptic was very likely the correct term for his. Even thinking he could rescue Kivrin, Dunworthy thought, he was worn out. By the time Colin got him back to his room, and his temp was back up, "You rest," Colin said. Helping him into bed, "You can't have a relapse. If you're going to rescue Kivrin, I need to see Badri," he said. "And Finch, I'll take care of everything," Colin said and darted out. He would need to arrange his ambulance discharge and med support for the pickup in case Gibrin was ill. He would need a plague inoculation. He wondered how long would be required for it to take effect. Mary had said she'd immunized Kivrin while she was in hospital for her quadra implant. That had been 2 weeks before the drop, but perhaps it didn't take that long to confer immunity. The nurse came in to check his temp. "I'm just going off duty," she said, reading his patch. "How soon can I be discharged?" he asked. "Discharged," she said, sounding surprised. "You must be feeling better." "I am," he said. "How long?" She frowned. There's a good deal of difference between being ready for a bit of a walk and being ready to go home. She adjusted the drip. "You don't want to overdo." She went out, and after a few minutes, Colin came in with Finch and the Middle Ages book. "I thought perhaps you'd need this for costumes and things." He dumped it on Dunworthy's legs. "I'll just go fetch Madri," he dashed out. "You're looking a good deal better, sir," Finch said. "I'm so glad. I'm afraid you're badly needed at Balliol. It's Mrs. Gadsden. She's accused Balliol of undermining William's health. She says the combined strain of the epidemic and reading Petrarch has broken his health. She's threatening to go to the head of the history faculty with it. Tell her she's more than welcome to try. Basingham's in Scotland somewhere," Dunworthy said. "I need you to find how long in advance of exposure an inoculation against bubonic plague needs to be given. And I need the laboratory readied for a drop. We're using it for storage just now," Finch said. "We've had several shipments of supplies from London, though none of lavatory paper, even though I specifically requested. Move them into the hall," Dunworthy said. "I want the net ready as soon as possible." Colin opened the door with his elbow and wheeled Bartery in, using his other arm and a knee to hold it open. "I had to sneak him past the ward sister," he said breathlessly. He pushed the wheelchair up to the bed. "I want," Dunworthy said and stopped. Looking at Madri, the thing was impossible. Battery was in no condition to run the net. He looked exhausted by the mere effort of having been brought from the ward, and he was fumbling at the pocket of his robe as he added his sash. "We'll need to RTN's a light measure and a gateway," Padre said, and his voice sounded exhausted too, but the despair had gone out of it. "And we'll need authorizations for both drop and pickup." "What about the protesters who were at Brasenose?" Dunworthy asked. "Will they try to prevent the drop?" "No," Colin said. "They're over at the National Trust headquarters. They're trying to shut down the dig." "Good," Dunworthy thought. Montoya will be too occupied with trying to defend her churchyard against picketers to interfere. Too occupied to look for Kivern's corridor. What else will you need? He asked Pedri, an insular memory and redundant for the backup. He pulled a sheet of paper from the pocket and looked at it, and a remote hookup so I can run parameter checks. He handed the list to Dunworthy, who handed it to Finch. We'll also need med support for Kivern, Dunworthy said, and I want a telephone installed in this room. Finch was frowning at the list. And don't tell me we're out of any of these, Dunworthy said before he could protest. Beg, borrow, or steal them. He turned back to Bettery. Will you need anything else to be discharged? Padras said. Which I'm afraid will be the greatest obstacle. He's right, Collins said. Sister, we'll never let him out. I had to sneak him in here. Who's your doctor? Dunworthy asked. Dr. Gates. Badri said, but surely we can explain the situation. Dunworthy interrupted. Explain that it's an emergency. Badri shook his head. The last thing we can do is tell him the circumstances. I persuaded him to discharge me, to open the net while you were ill. He didn't think I was well enough, but he allowed it, and then when I had the relapse. Dunworthy looked anxiously at him. Are you certain you're capable of running the net? Perhaps I can get Andrews, now that the epidemic's under control. There isn't time, Patri said, and it was my fault. I want to run the net. Perhaps Mr. Finch can find another doctor. Yes, Dunworthy said, and tell mine I need to speak with him. He reached for Collins' book. I'll need a costume. He flipped through the pages, looking for an illustration of medieval clothing. No strips, no zippers, no buttons. He found a picture of Boccaccio and showed it to Finch. I doubt your 20th century has anything. Telephone the Dramatic Society and see if they've got something. I'll do my best, sir, Finch said, frowning doubtfully at the illustration. The door crashed open and the sister rattled in, enraged. Mr. Dunworthy, this is utterly irresponsible, she said in a tone that had no doubt caused casualties from the Second Falklands War terrors. If you will not take care of your own health, you might at the least not endanger that of the other patients. She fixed her gaze on Finch. Mr. Dunworthy is to have no more visitors. She glared at Colin and then snatched the wheelchair handles from him. What can you have been thinking of, Mr. Chokri, she said, whipping the wheelchair around so smartly. Batty's head snapped back. You have already had one relapse. I have no intention of allowing you to have another. She pushed him out. I told you we'd never get him out, Colin said. She flung the door open again. No visitor, she said to Colin. I'll be back, Colin whispered, and ducked past her. She fixed him with her ancient eye. Not if I have anything to say about it. She apparently had something to say about it. Colin didn't return till after she'd gone off duty, and then only to bring the remote hookup to Bardry and report to Dunworthy on plague inoculations. Finch had telephoned the NHS. It took 2 weeks for the inoculation to confer full immunity and 7 days before partial, and Mr. Finch wants to know if you shouldn't also be inoculated against cholera and typhoid. There isn't time, he said. There wasn't time for a plague inoculation either. Kevin had already been there over 3 weeks, and every day lowered her chances of survival, and he was no closer to being discharged. As soon as Colin left, he rang William's nurse and told her he wanted to see his doctor. I'm ready to be discharged, he said. She laughed. I'm completely recovered, he said. I did 10 laps in the corridor this morning. She shook her head. The incidence of relapse in this virus has been extremely high. I simply can't take the risk. She smiled at him. Where is it you're so determined to go? Surely, whatever it is can survive another week without you. It's the start of term, he said, and realized that was true. Please tell my doctor I wish to see him. Dr. Warden will only tell you what I've told you, she said, but she apparently relayed the message because he tutted in after tea. He had obviously been hauled out of a senile retirement To help with the epidemic, he told a long and pointless story about medical conditions during the pandemic, and then pronounced creakily, "In my day we kept people in hospital till they were fully recovered." Dunworthy didn't try to argue with him. He waited until he and the sister had hobbled down the corridor, sharing reminiscences from the 100 Years' War, and then strapped on his portable drip and walked to the public phone near casualties to get a progress report from Finch. "The sister won't allow a phone in your room," Finch said, "but I've good news about the plague. A course of streptomycin injections, along with gamma globulin and T-cell enhancement, will confer temporary immunity and can be started as little as 12 hours before exposure." "Good," Dunworthy said. "Find me a doctor who'll give them, and authorize my discharge, a young doctor, and send Colin over." "Is the net ready?" "Very nearly, sir. I've obtained the necessary drop and pickup authorizations, and I've located a remote hookup. I was just going to fetch it." Now he rang off, and Dunworthy walked back to the room. He hadn't lied to the nurse. He was feeling stronger with each passing moment, though there was a tightness around his lower ribs. By the time he made it back to his room, Mrs. Gadsden was there, searching eagerly through her Bible for morons and agues and emeralds. "Read me Luke 11 verse 9. Dunworthy said. She looked it up. "And I say unto you, ask, and it shall be given you." She read, glaring at him suspiciously. "Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you." Miss Taylor came at the very end of visiting hours, carrying a measuring tape. "Colin sent me to get your measurements," she said. "The old croon out there won't let him on the floor." She draped the tape around his waist. "I had to tell her I was visiting." "Miss Pontini, hold your arm out straight." She stretched the tape along his arm. "She's feeling a lot better. She may even get to ring Rambo's when at last my Savior cometh with us on the 5th 10th. We're doing it for holy reform. You know, but the NHS has taken over the church. So, Mr. Finch has very kindly let us use Balio's chapel." "What size shoe do you wear?" She jotted down his various measurements, told him Colin would be in the next day, and not to worry, the net was nearly ready. She went out presumably to visit Miss Pontini, and came back a few minutes later with a message from Bedry. "Mr. Dunworthy, I've run 20 for parameter checks. It read all 20 for show minimal slippage. 11 show slippage of less than an hour. 5 slippage of less than 5 minutes. I'm running divergence checks and DARs to try to find out what it is. I know what it is," Dunworthy thought. "It's the Black Death. The function of the slippage was to prevent interactions that might affect history. 5 minutes slippage meant there were no anachronisms, no critical meetings. The continuum must keep from happening. It meant the drop was to an uninhabited area. It meant the plague had been there, and all the contempts were dead. Colin didn't come in the morning, and after lunch, Dunworthy walked to the public phone again and rang Finch. "I haven't been able to find a doctor willing to take on new cases," Finch said. "I've telephoned every doctor and medic within the perimeter, and a good many of them are still down with flu." He apologized. "And several of them." He stopped, but Dunworthy knew what he had intended to say. Several of them had died, including the one who would certainly have helped, who would have given him the inoculations and discharged Bedry. Great Aunt Mary wouldn't have given up. Colin had said she wouldn't have, he thought, in spite of the sister and Mrs. Gadsden. A band of pain below the ribs. If she were here, she would have helped him however she could. He walked back to his room. The sister had posted a large placard reading, "Absolutely no visitors allowed," on his door. But she was not at her desk or in his room. Colin was carrying a large, damp parcel. "The sister's in the ward," Colin said, grinning. Miss Pontini very conveniently fainted. "You should have seen her. She's very good at it." He fumbled with the string. "The nurse just came on duty. But you needn't worry about her either. She's in the linen room with William Gadsden." He opened the parcel. It was full of clothing, a long black doublet and black breeches, neither of them remotely medieval, and a pair of women's black tights. "Where'd you get this?" Dunworthy said. "A production of Hamlet, Richard III. Colin said Keble did it last term." I took the hump out. "Is there a cloak?" Dunworthy said. Sorting through the clothing, "Tell Finch to find me a cloak. A long cloak that will cover everything." "I will." Colin said absently. He was fumbling intently with the band on his green jacket. It sprang open and Colin threw it off his shoulders. "Well, what do you think?" He had done considerably better than Finch. The boots were wrong. They looked like a pair of gardener's Wellingtons. But the brown burlap smock and shapeless gray brown trousers looked like the illustration of a serf. In Colin's book, the trousers have a strip. Colin said, "But you can't see it under the shirt." I copied it out of the book. "I'm supposed to be your squire." He should have anticipated this. "Carlin," he said, "you can't go with me." "Why not?" Colin said. "I can help you find her. I'm good at finding things." "It's impossible though." "Oh, now, you're going to tell me how dangerous it is." "In the Middle Ages, aren't you?" "Well, it's rather dangerous here." "Isn't it?" "What about Aunt Mary? She'd have been safer in the Middle Ages. Wouldn't she have been doing lots of dangerous things? Taking medicine to people and putting up placards in the wards. While you were ill, I did all sorts of dangerous things. You don't even know about Colin. You're too old to go alone. And Great Aunt Mary told me to take care of you." "What if you have a relapse?" "Colin, my mother doesn't care if I go." "But I do. I can't take you with me. Saying just sit here and wait," he said bitterly, "and nobody will tell me anything. And I won't know whether you're alive or dead." He picked up the jacket. "It's not fair, I know. Can I come to the laboratory at least?" "Yes, I still think you should let me go." He said. He began folding the tights. "Shall I leave your costume here?" "Better not. The sister might confiscate it." "What's all this, Mr. Dunworthy?" Mrs. Gadsden said. They both jumped. She came into the room bearing her Bible. "Colin's been collecting for the clothing drive," Dunworthy said. "Helping him wad the clothing into a bundle for the detainees. Passing clothes from one person to another is an excellent way of spreading infection," she said to Dunworthy. Colin scooped up the bundle and ducked out, and allowing a child to come here and risk catching something. He offered to come and walk me home from the infirmary last night, and I said, "I won't have you risking your health for me." She sat down next to the bed and opened her Bible. "It's pure negligence allowing that boy to visit you. But I suppose it's no more than what I should have expected. From the way you run your college, Mr. Finch has become a complete tyrant. In your absence, he simply flew at me in a rage yesterday when I requested an extra roll of lavatory paper. "I want to see William," Dunworthy said. Here she sputtered. In hospital, she shut her Bible with a snap. "I simply won't allow it. There are still a great many infectious cases. And poor Willie is in the linen room with my nurse." He thought, "Tell him I wish to see him as soon as possible." He said. She brandished the Bible at him. "Like Moses bringing down the plagues on Egypt, I intend to report your callous indifference to your students' well-being to the head of the history faculty," she said, and stormed out. He could hear her complaining loudly in the corridor to someone, presumably the nurse, because William appeared almost immediately, smoothing down his hair. "I need injections of streptomycin and gamma globulin," Dunworthy said. "I also need to be discharged from hospital, as does Bartery Chowdhury." He nodded. "I know. Colin told me. You're going to try to retrieve your historian." He looked thoughtful. "I know this nurse. A nurse can't give an injection without authorization by a doctor, and the discharges will require authorization as well. I know a girl up in records. When do you want this?" "By soon as possible." "I'll get right on it. Might take 2 or 3 days," he said, and started out. "I met Kivrin once. She was at Balliol to see you. She's very pretty, isn't she? I must remember to warn her about him." Dunworthy thought and realized he had actually begun to believe he might be able to rescue her in spite of everything. Hold on, he thought. I'm coming to her 3 days. He spent the afternoon walking up and down the corridor, trying to build his strength up. Bardry's ward had an absolutely no visitors allowed placard on each of the doors, and the sister fixed him with a watery blue eye each time he approached them. Colin came in, wet and breathless, with a pair of boots for Dunworthy. She has guards everywhere. He said, Mr. Finch says to tell you the net's ready, except he can't find anyone to do med support. Tell William to arrange it. He said he's taking care of the discharges and the streptomycin injection. I know I've got to deliver a message to Battery from him. I'll be back. He did not come back, and neither did William. When Dunworthy walked to the phone to ring Balliol, the sister caught him halfway and escorted him back to his room. Either her tightened defenses included Mrs. Gadsden as well, or Mrs. Gadsden was still angry over William. She did not come all afternoon. Just after tea, a pretty nurse he hadn't seen before came in with a syringe. Sister's been called away on an emergency, she said. What's that? He asked, pointing to the syringe. She tapped the console keyboard with one finger of her free hand. She looked at the screen, tapped in a few more characters, and came around to inject him. Streptomycin, she said. She did not seem nervous or furtive, which meant William must have managed the authorization somehow. She injected the largest syringe into the cannula, smiled at him, and went out. She had left the console on. He got out of bed and went round to read what was on the screen. It was his chart. He recognized it because it looked like Badri's and was as unreadable. The last entry read, I see you 1580 to 69114-1-55 180 5150 stroke RPT 18 CRS 1 meter STMC 4 ml stroke Q 6HN HS4 0-11-7 meters errands. He sat down on the bed. Oh, Mary. William must have obtained her access code, perhaps from his friend in records, and fed it into the computer. Records was no doubt far behind, swamped by the paperwork of the epidemic, and had not yet got to Mary's death. They would catch the error someday, though the resourceful William had no doubt already arranged for its erasure. He scrolled the screen back through his chart. There were M. Aaron's entries up through 8/155, the day she had died. She must have nursed him until she could no longer stand. No wonder her heart had stopped. He switched the console off so that the sister wouldn't spot the entry and got into bed. He wondered if William planned to sign her name to the discharges as well. He hoped so. She would have wanted to help. No one came in all evening. The sister hobbled in to check his tack bracelet and gave him his temp at 8 o'clock, and she entered them in the console, but didn't appear to notice anything. A 10-a-second nurse, also pretty, came in, repeated the streptomycin injection, and gave him one of gamma globulin. She left the screen on, and down there, he lay down so he could see Mary's name. He didn't think he would be able to sleep, but he did. He dreamed of Egypt and the Valley of the Kings. Mr. Dunworthy, wake up. Carlin whispered. He was shining a pocket torch in his face. What is it? Dunworthy said, blinking against the light. He groped for his spectacles. What's happened? It's me, Colin, he whispered. He turned the torch on. Himself, he was wearing, for some unknown reason, a large white lab coat, and his face looked strained, sinister in the upturned light of the torch. What's wrong? Dunworthy asked. Nothing, Colin whispered. You're being discharged. Dunworthy hooked his spectacles over his ears. He still couldn't see anything. What time is it? He whispered. For a clock. He thrust his slippers at him and turned the torch on the closet. Do hurry. He took Dunworthy's robe off the hook and handed it to him. She's likely to come back any moment. Dunworthy fumbled with the robe and slippers, trying to wake up, wondering why they were being discharged. At this odd hour, and where the sister was, Colin went to the door and peeked. Out he switched the torch off, stuck it in the pocket of the too large lab coat, and eased the door shut. After a long breath-holding moment, he opened it a crack and looked out. "All clear," he said, motioning to Dunworthy. "William's taken her into the linen room." "Oh, the nurse?" Dunworthy asked, still groggy. "Why is she on duty? Not the nurse, the sister. William's keeping her in there till we're gone." "What about Mrs. Gadsden?" Colin looked sheepish. "She's reading to Mr. Latimer. He said defensively I had to do something with her. And Mr. Latimer can't hear her. He opened the door all the way. There was a wheelchair just outside. He took hold of the handles. I can walk," Dunworthy said. "There isn't time," Colin whispered. "And if anyone sees us, I can tell them I'm taking you up to scanning." Dunworthy sat down and let Colin push him down the corridor and past the linen room and Latimer's room. He could hear Mrs. Gadsden's voice dimly through the door reading from Exodus. Colin continued on tiptoe to the end of the corridor and then took off at a rate that could not possibly be mistaken for taking a patient to scanning, down another corridor around a corner, and out the side door where they had been accosted. By the end of time is near Sandwich Board. It was pitch black in the alley and raining hard. He could only dimly make out the ambulance, parked at the street end. Colin knocked on the back of it with his fist, and an ambulance attendant jumped down. It was the medic who had helped bring Bettery in, and had picketed Brasenose. "Can you climb up?" she asked, blushing. Dunworthy nodded and stood up. "Pull the doors to," she told Colin, and went round to get in the front. "Don't tell me she's a friend of William's," Dunworthy said, looking after her. "Of course," Colin said. "She asked me what sort of mother-in-law I thought Mrs. Gadsden would be." He helped him up the step and into the ambulance. "Where's Bardry?" Dunworthy asked, wiping the rain off his spectacles. Colin pulled the doors to. "Abigail, we took him first so he could set up the net." He looked anxiously out the back window. "I do hope Sister doesn't sound the alarm before we're gone." "I shouldn't worry about it," Dunworthy said. He had clearly underestimated William's powers. The ancient sister was probably on William's lap, in the linen room, embroidering their intertwined initials on the towels. Colin switched on the torch and shone it on the stretcher. "I brought your costume," he said, handing Dunworthy the black doublet. Dunworthington took off his robe and put it on. The ambulance started up, nearly knocking him over. He sat down on the side bench, bracing himself against the swaying side, and pulled on the black tights. William's medic had not switched on the siren, but she was going at such a rate. She should have. Dunworthy clung to the strap with one hand and pulled on the breeches with the other, and Colin, reaching for the boots, nearly went over on his head. "We found you a cloak," Colin said. "Mr. Finch borrowed it off the Classical Theatre Society." He shook it out. It was Victorian black and lined in red silk. He draped it over Dunworthy's shoulders. "What production did they put on Dracula?" The ambulance lurched to a stop, and the medic yanked open the door. Colin helped Dunworthy down, holding up the train of the voluminous cloak. Like a page boy, they ducked in under the gate. The rain pattered loudly on the stones overhead, and under the sound of the rain was a clanging sound. "What's that?" Dunworthy asked, peering out into the dark quad. "When at last my Savior cometh," Colin said. "The Americans are practicing it for some church thing. Necrotic, isn't it?" Mrs. Gadsden said they were practicing at all hours, but I'd no idea she meant 5 in the morning. "The concert's tonight," Colin said. "Tonight," Dunworthy said, and realized it was the 15th, the 6th on the Julian calendar Epiphany. The arrival of the wise men. Finch hurried toward them with an umbrella. "Sorry I'm late," he said, holding it over Dunworthy. "But I couldn't find an umbrella. You've no idea how many of the detainees go off. And forget them, especially the Americans." Dunworthy started across the quad. "Is everything ready?" "The med support's not here yet," Finch said, attempting to keep the umbrella over Danworthy's head. But William Gadsden just telephoned to say it was all arranged and she'd be here shortly. Dunworthy would not have been surprised if he had said the sister had volunteered for the job. "I do hope William never decides to take to a life of crime." He said, "Oh, I don't think he would, sir. His mother would never allow it." He ran a few steps trying to keep up. "Mr. Chowdhury is running the preliminary coordinates, and Miss Montoya is here." He stopped. "Montoya? What is it?" "I don't know, sir. She said she had information for you." Not now, he thought. Not when we're this close. He went in the laboratory. Battery was at the console, and Montoya, wearing her terrorist jacket and muddy jeans, was leaning over him watching the screen. Badri said something to her, and she shook her head and looked at her digital. She glanced up and saw Dunworthy, and an expression of compassion came into her face. She stood up and reached in the pocket of her shirt. "No," Dunworthy thought. She walked over to him. "I didn't know you were planning this," she said, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. "I want to help." She handed him the paper. This is what information Kevin had to work with when she went through. He looked at the paper in his hand. It was a map. "This is the drop." She pointed to a cross on a black line. "And this is Skengate. You'll recognize it by the church. It's Norman with murals above the rood screen. And a statue of St. Anthony." She smiled at him. "The patron saint of lost objects. I found the statue yesterday." She pointed to several other crosses. If by some chance she didn't go to Skengate, the most likely villages are Escote, Hennefeld, and Shrivenham. I've listed their distinguishing landmarks on the back. Badri stood up and came over. He looked even frailer than he had in the ward, if that were possible, and he moved slowly like the old man he had become. "I'm still getting minimal slippage, no matter what variables I feed in," he said. He put his hand under his ribs. "I'm running an intermittent opening for 5 minutes at 2-hour intervals. That way we can hold the net open for up to 24 hours. 36 if we're lucky." Dunworthy wondered how many of those 2-hour intervals Badri would hold up for. He looked done in already.